Ancient Chinese, dressed in vibrant scarlet robes, gathered in the city center to play majestic flute melodies, filling the streets with the sounds of a festival that celebrated the culture, history, and spirit of ancient China. In the square where the courtiers and noble guests were gathering, a loud voice suddenly rang out, triumphantly announcing that the noble family of Xenia Yoren had finally presented a concubine to the empress. All around, to the rhythm of exciting music, maidens were performing a dance with blushing cheeks. The two high-ranking men, standing in the shadow of the balcony, silently watched the graceful movements of the girls, discussing among themselves that the Xenia Yoren clan had long been famous for its descendants, possessing great strength and innate magical gifts. The little girl, all wrapped in a scarlet veil, sat quietly on the cold stone floor, her face hidden from prying eyes, and, holding her breath, she patiently waited for the moment when fate would take its step towards her unknown future. This little child, wrapped in a scarlet veil with fine embroidery, had been sitting motionless on her knees in the middle of the hall for 2 hours, and in front of her, like a sacred symbol of her future destiny, on a decorated stand, rested an exquisite headdress, a golden diadem. The advisors, dressed in elegant blue hanfu, dressed in all the canons of palace etiquette, stood a little to the side, whispering to each other, discussing the affairs of the empire, when suddenly their conversations were interrupted by a solemn announcement, loudly announcing the arrival of the empress herself. The ruler majestically entered the marble-decorated throne room, accompanied by the quiet rustle of her clothes, her long black hair flowing down her back like a river of night, and on her head sparkled the mianguan, the imperial attire inlaid with precious jade. As soon as her steps sounded near the courtiers, everyone present, from senior advisors to young servants, instantly froze in awe and bowed deeply, respectfully lowering their heads, expressing devotion and respect for the one whose will was stronger than fate and whose words sounded like law. The woman slowly and smoothly approached the dais, surrounded by incense burners with the aroma of sandalwood, sat down on the majestic throne with a straight posture, placing her graceful hands on the carved armrests of dark wood, and her calm gaze showed inner strength. The empress, whose name sounded like a frozen legend, Yeva Aryun, was strikingly distinguished by her beauty. Emerald green eyes sparkled like precious stones, dark as silk. Hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and a cold and flawlessly chiseled face. The girl, in scarlet ceremonial robes, with her face covered by a veil, sat, just as before, on the cold stone floor in a deep bow, without raising her head, as if she herself were part of an ancient rite, the meaning of which was known only to the heavens and to her alone. The mistress, looking around the hall with a calm but intent gaze, asked with slight surprise in her voice what was going on here, clearly not expecting to see such a strange picture among the celebrations arranged in her honor, when everything should have gone according to a strictly prescribed scenario. At the very foot of the stairs leading to the throne, like a figure forgotten by everyone, sat a tiny girl, and, despite the solemn silence of the hall, was in no hurry to rise, as if time had stopped for her and nothing could disturb her inner silence. Only one woman's hand slowly rose upward, her long, slender fingers, adorned with rings, seeming to flow from the sleeve of the imperial robe, and without uttering a word, Yeva Aryun commanded absolute silence, which was to reign without objection. At that very moment, all the flutists in that place, as if by a magic sign, stopped playing. The music died down, the sounds dissolved into the air, and a tense, almost mystical silence spread over the throne room, in which one could even hear the beating of one's own heart. The ruler, who had previously maintained a majestic calm, suddenly and abruptly rose from the throne. Her movement was so swift that even the most imperturbable of the courtiers could not hide their surprise. No one expected such a thing from her. Without wasting a second, the beautiful woman walked with quick, confident steps towards her new concubine, a tiny girl who was still bowing on the stone floor, as if she did not believe that the empress herself could pay attention to her. When a short but powerful command was given to raise her head, the little girl obediently followed it. The face, barely visible from under the veil, turned out to be surprisingly beautiful. Violet eyes shimmered with a restrained light, black hair softly framed delicate, almost porcelain skin. The woman, hardened in palace intrigues, and brought up in a world where feelings were hidden behind the steel of will, froze for a moment in shock. The girl did not expect that this girl would be so young and fragile. Her age turned out to be truly shocking. The Empress's concubines, sitting a little to the side, listened with bated breath as their mistress asked with cold interest how old her new subject was. And when the girl quietly but clearly answered that she was only 8 years old, a wave of silent horror swept through the hall. Sanya Yoran froze in a tense and awkward posture, as if she herself had turned to stone when she heard the fury in the Empress's voice as she expressed her anger. It was obvious that she was deeply indignant and shocked that the Sanya Yoran aristocratic family dared to send a very young child to the imperial harem. The advisors standing at a distance immediately became animated. Their heads bowed towards each other, and, not daring to speak out loud, they began to whisper heatedly, spreading gossip like poison throughout the entire hall. Each one striving to be the first to know how the fate of the Sanya Yoran clan would change. The girl suddenly froze, her large eyes wide open in amazement, when a clear and unexpected order reached her to return home. She did not believe what she heard, because she did not expect such a gift of fate and did not dare to even imagine it in her thoughts. She tried to rise slowly on trembling legs, but as soon as her body moved from its place, a sudden, sharp pain pierced every bone and muscle, and her face distorted into a terrible grimace of horror and suffering, as if she was holding back a scream with all her might. The Empress, who had impeccable self-control and was accustomed to obedience, could not remain indifferent this time. Genuine horror flashed in her eyes when she saw how much pain the child was in, and for a moment she froze, shocked to the depths of her soul. The woman, overcoming her stupor, rushed forward and caught the girl, holding her in her arms, not allowing her to fall to the stone floor. The little girl's body could barely stand on its feet. It trembled as if broken, and even the sternest courtiers fell silent for a moment from shock. The Empress, showing such obvious gentleness for the first time, leaned towards the child, and with obvious excitement in her voice, asked if everything was all right. Her eyes were anxious, and her tone was unusually warm, as if concern had broken through the icy shell of power. A man with short, bright red hair and a long silver earring in one ear stood in the shadow of the columns, watching what was happening with a gloomy expression on his face. His gaze showed incomprehension, distrust, and inner wariness. Nearby was another man, with platinum hair and flaming scarlet eyes, dressed in red clothes. His face was distorted with anger. Jealousy flared up in him like a fire, and it seemed that another moment, and he would break away from the spot, forgetting about palace ethics. A third stood apart from everyone else, holding his breath. A blind man with a sky-colored bandage covering his eyes, his hair the whiteness of winter snow. He said nothing, but his silence was heavier than loud words, and the tension around him was felt on the skin. Sanya Yoran involuntarily shuddered when she felt an unexpectedly light but powerful touch on her shoulder. She opened her mouth as if about to say something, but then frowned, feeling an anxious premonition creep into her chest. The ruler's concern did not bode well. The woman watched the girl with anxious caution, and her large eyes showed obvious concern, which in itself seemed unusual, even ominous. Such sincere excitement from the lips of the ruler never boded well. The young girl, noticing the change in the face of the great empress, hastily tried to dispel the woman's anxiety, raising her gaze and softly, but confidently, saying that she was all right, trying with all her might to speak calmly, despite the pain that fettered her every step. With reverent politeness, the beautiful girl slowly bowed before the empress, bowing her head as if acknowledging her greatness, and in a quiet but clear voice said that she was going to leave now, not wishing to cause unnecessary excitement in the palace. The little girl, gathering all her courage, carefully stepped back, with each step feeling the pain piercing her legs, but she did not allow herself to give up. She steadfastly clenched her teeth and continued to walk, despite the heaviness that fettered her body, without showing weakness. The golden crown, studded with precious stones, on her head swayed as she took a step, ringing and shimmering like a reminder of her fragility, but with it remained an unbearable resilience, as if she were fighting fate itself, refusing to give in. Finally, Sanya Yoran, realizing that her presence was no longer required, turned decisively and walked away. her gaze firm and her face unwaveringly calm, as if she were breaking out of the shadows, leaving behind everything that connected her to this place, ready for new challenges. The imperial courtyard seemed vast and austere. The gray buildings, built in the ancient Chinese style, standing on either side like silent guards, watching over the peace and quiet that eternity brought to this corner of the world. There, in a secluded room with wooden walls and a modest bed, Sanya Yoren lay half asleep, her body tired and her thoughts wandering in a misty ocean of dreams where everything seemed distant and unfinished, like the mysterious puzzle she found herself searching for. She woke up, barely having slept enough on the hard wooden bed, and rubbed her eyes with difficulty, trying to get rid of the residual fatigue that did not leave her. Sleep, like a thick fog, continued to envelop her consciousness, making it difficult to clearly perceive reality and pulling her back into the world of dreams. After that, the little girl glanced at her stupid neighbor, who was peacefully sleeping next to her on a large bed. Her breathing was even, and her face expressed complete serene calm, despite the fact that she so rudely took the soft bed away from the girl. The neighbor, a young girl with freckles, was sleeping peacefully, lying on her back, with her mouth slightly open, from which saliva was flowing invisibly. And it was she who, without any regret, took away Sanya Yoren's bed, leaving her with the only choice, to spend the night on a hard wooden bed, experiencing discomfort and annoyance. Sanya Yoren, in turn, tried more than once to convince her friend to give up her bed in the evening, offering to swap places, but she rudely refused, ordering her to find another place to sleep, without showing the slightest sympathy or desire to give in even a little. The little girl, realizing that her request would remain unanswered, sighed with deep regret, took off her blue shoes, and, feeling how fatigue penetrated every cell of her body, carefully got out of bed, deciding that now she would have to look for a more comfortable place to rest. Sweet Sanya Yoren, sighing heavily, grabbed the door of the large window, sadly thinking that, despite her position as the Empress's concubine, she still remained an object of neglect and indifference from those around her. She regretfully opened the window, allowing fresh air to enter the room, and, looking out at nature, she became lost in thought, watching the dry branches of the trees and the birds that fluttered peacefully among their bare branches, creating the illusion of peace in this harsh world. The Sorak Empire, once thought lost in the legends of the Celestial Empire, now stretches across the vast lotus-covered lands of the ancient East, where majestic palaces crowned the mountain ranges like jewels and homes shone under the light of the crescent moon. This great land was richly blessed by the Blue Dragon, an ancient divine being with eyes shining with molten golden light, whose wisdom and indomitable strength filled the hearts of rulers with power, and the sky with magical grace and eternal patronage. By the priceless grace of the heavenly patron, all noble families belonging to the ancient and noble class of the Sorak Empire gained power. The powers of telekinesis, control of destructive elements, the gift of clairvoyance, telepathy, and other supernatural abilities. Into this magical world filled with enchantments, ancient traditions, and hidden intrigues, one day a girl arrived, sent as a concubine. Her name was Sanya Yoren, and she had mesmerizing violet eyes and thick black hair that fell like the silk of the night. The land was ruled by the great empress, a woman of unyielding will, immense grace and profound wisdom, whose presence made entire dynasties tremble, and whose power extended from the heavenly mountains to the very last coastal village of the Sorak Empire. The seventh family of the Sorak Empire was renowned for its ancient lineage, and it was from this family that a man emerged with hair as silver as winter frost, mischievous eyes the color of the moonlit sky, and a hidden smile standing by the columns as if he were carved from the light itself. However, the story of Sanya Yoren ended tragically and cruelly. The girl, whose heart knew no malice, was soon killed out of jealousy because she, by the will of fate, received a blessing and, moreover, aroused the sincere love of the great empress herself. This strange reverse harem novel, filled with intrigue, magic, and palace drama, was read by the main character just a couple of days ago on her phone screen, unaware that she would soon find herself in the body of a secondary character in this story. When she opened her eyes and realized that her soul was now trapped in the body of the girl from the novel, the servants, without saying a word, began to dress her in silk, and the new father, in a formal hanfu, with a cold face and contempt in his voice, immediately began to threaten the lovely girl. His name was Kyun Yoran, a stern, cold-blooded, and ruthless man with a piercing gaze, and without hiding the slightest contempt, he made it clear to his daughter that if she dared to return from the palace in disgrace, he would kill her himself and throw her body to the pigs to be torn apart. Anyone who, by fate or coincidence, found themselves in the imperial palace instantly lost their mind and self-control at the sight of the great empress. Her beauty was dazzling, her grandeur was merciless, and her smile was capable of plunging into oblivion. In search of a clever way out and a desire to eliminate a possible threat, the advisor suggested to Mr. Kyun Yoran to send his own daughter to the palace, a girl without any magical abilities, but with a rare, almost inhuman beauty, as bait. The maids helped the girl get ready with indifference and cold haste, fastening heavy hairpins, pearl pendants, golden combs, and curved ornaments on the woman's head. She was an unloved child, born without a gift into a proud family. Now the young girl, wrapped in lush, stuffy clothes with silk sleeves, sat sadly by the window in the decorated room, and, looking at the gray, cloud-covered horizon, thought how unfair, cruel, and scary it was for her to end up in this place. As if by the cruel, unchanging rules of an ancient harem romance, all the concubines desperately competed with each other, secretly despising each other, because each one strove at any cost to gain the favor and rare love of the great empress. The woman's bright red eyes, like molten rubies with a glint of heat, looked down from the height of the throne with intent concentration, not missing the slightest detail, as if looking for weakness in everyone who fell into the field of her attention and enormous will. And now, when the great ruler suddenly showed interest and kind, almost affectionate concern for the young Sanya Yoran, all the other concubines were instantly filled with hatred because the girl had attracted the attention of the woman who ruled the world. The little girl sat quietly and motionless, her dull, detached gaze lowered and her thin, wax-like hands crossed on her knees, clad in stifling, heartbreakingly heavy fabrics, feeling her strength draining away and other people's gazes burning right through her, as if already accusing her. Sanya Yoran resolutely, through internal resistance, fear and pain, with anxious weariness in her heart, swore to herself to become the ideal, flawless daughter of the imperial palace, to go to bed early, to speak quietly and rarely, to obey without complaint, not to argue, not to cry, and not to throw tantrums. Then, if everything goes smoothly and perfectly, no one will pay much attention to her, and those around her will begin to perceive her as an invisible, harmless shadow, seriously, but detachedly, as if she were simply part of the beautiful interior of the imperial palace. The empress, quickly growing tired of the monotony and the sparkless personalities, would soon lose interest in her, and, as the girl hoped, would turn away indifferently, meaning that the danger would pass, even if only temporarily, like a delayed storm, gradually dying down. The little girl stepped carefully onto the cold floor, the touch of which sent an unpleasant chill through her, and her blue shoes, decorated with delicate patterns in the form of clouds, fit tightly around her feet, and each of her steps sounded in the empty room like an echo of unspoken fear. Suddenly, with a quiet but noticeable sigh and a lazy movement, her stupid neighbor woke up. A girl with an impudent, smug smile, stretched sleepily on her bed, as if everything that was happening did not concern her, and the world around was created only for her pleasure. Rudely, and with obvious irritation, the young girl asked why little Sanya Yoran was speaking to her so impolitely, suddenly wondering why she was sleeping on the concubine's soft bed instead of lying modestly on the bench, as everyone else was supposed to. The girl grabbed a soft pillow from the bed, squeezing it in her hands, and, grinning with a sly smile, said that such a soft and comfortable bed was too cozy for such a little thing as her poor neighbor, who clearly had no place among the senior concubines. Sanya Yoran, turning away from the girl with obvious contempt, not wanting to continue this useless and empty conversation, coldly replied that if the maid woke up, then let her help her get dressed, since this clearly did not suit her interlocutor, and she sighed heavily from irritation and hatred. The girl, with obvious dissatisfaction and the feeling that she could not let go of the situation, finally stood up from her seat and, gritting her teeth, began to help Sanya Yoran with her clothes, choosing a new pink dress for her that was supposed to emphasize her status among the other concubines. In the original, when Sanya Yoran complained to the empress about her cruel and unfair treatment, it immediately made her an object of hatred among the other concubines, who could not forgive her insolence, arrogance, and openness in expressing her feelings and emotions. The maid tightened the little mistress's pink belt very tightly, causing the sweet little girl to involuntarily shudder, feeling how the fabric was squeezing and restricting her movements, causing pain in her stomach. But despite this, she remained silent, not wanting to show her weakness. But instead of screaming in pain, little Sanya Yoran, without giving in to her emotions, looked away and calmly said that this would do, even though it was painful, and then, with cold determination in her voice, ordered the maid to go away and leave her chambers. The girl in the yellow hanfu froze in surprise upon hearing such an unexpected order, as if she could not believe that she was being sent away, not only from this room, but also, probably, from the palace, where she was accustomed to being not just a servant, but a part of everyday life and its constant element. For Sanya Yoran, without hiding her irritation, and with cold determination in her voice, rudely told her to leave not only this room, but also the palace, clearly intending to get rid of the one who was her servant, with such firmness that it would have amazed anyone who was nearby. The beautiful little girl, thinking to herself, quietly thought that she was not going to leave someone by her side who would continue to complicate a woman's life, making her feel weak and helpless, because her face was expressionless as always. There were guards standing near the closed huge doors, and from behind them, the clear screams of a maid could be heard, who seemed to have no intention of leaving, despite the strict orders she had been given. All this was happening in front of the guards, which only made the situation worse. The girl was clearly angry with her young mistress, because she had been sent here by the master himself, the mistress's father, to monitor her behavior and not allow her to violate the established order, to always be nearby and carefully fulfill her role. The lady shuddered when she was found out. It turned out that she was a spy sent on a special mission, and her real intention was hidden under the mask of a submissive servant, which was a complete surprise for her and a huge shock, which she did not know how to cope with. There was clearly hatred and enmity between the Sanya Yoran family and the Empress, which sought to find its outlet in any manifestation of their relationship, and this incident only confirmed everything that had long been clear to both sides, who did not need words and explanations, but were obvious to everyone. The maid began to justify herself, trying to explain her behavior and her actions, but the mistress, not wanting to listen to her anymore, coldly turned away, not wanting to waste precious time on her pathetic excuses, which had long been boring to her and had no meaning. Suddenly, behind closed doors, a servant of the guard loudly announced that a boy named Sul had come to see the girl, breaking the silence that reigned in the room. This unexpected arrival attracted the attention of everyone present, causing them to look at each other with surprised glances. The servant watched in bewilderment as the handsome gentleman, without showing a shadow of politeness, raised his hand in a red sleeve and rudely opened the door, as if ignoring all propriety, which only worsened the atmosphere of bewilderment and tension that reigned in the room. Sanya Yoran and the girl next to them were also surprised by the loud sound and the sudden appearance of a new guest, who seemed to be an important figure who clearly attracted their attention with his unexpected visit and strong presence in this difficult situation. A man stepped inside wearing boots and a red hanfu, which was expensive and richly decorated, which immediately attracted the attention of everyone present, because his appearance was indicative and clearly stood out among the ordinary people in this palace. This charming, handsome man was named Zhou Yun. He was a tall man of Chinese descent, with golden hair and piercing red eyes in which a sly smile played. He greeted the Empress's new concubine with interest, making an indelible impression. A multitude of books, novels, and short stories surrounded this palace as an integral part of life and culture, absorbing the minds and hearts of those who had the good fortune to read them, and often immersing them in a world of fantasy and exciting adventures. The works were filled with passions, intrigues, and complex destinies. At their first meeting, the main character was frightened by this mysterious and enigmatic man named Zhou Yun, and, unable to withstand his penetrating gaze, she quickly ran away from him, feeling her heart beating wildly and her mind lost in complete bewilderment. Then, in despair and complete confusion, She complained to the empress, flushed with anger and excitement, herself dressed in a luxurious dress, feeling how her emotions were becoming almost uncontrollable from what had just happened and left a deep mark. The man who had brought her fear belonged to an ancient line of firebirds, known for their unique abilities and unusual powers passed down through generations. This wonderful line was associated with fire magic, and he himself was the embodiment of this power. The guy in question had an exceptional ability to control fire, and his power was undeniable, giving him a majestic and mysterious presence, making everyone around him feel his strength and power. His eyes were not only determined, but also filled with fiery determination. Sanya Yoren raised her head as another concubine, with a look of surprise on his face, walked up to her and greeted her, which made her heart flutter in surprise and confusion. This concubine's gaze was full of questioning emotions. Jo Yoon, appearing with a sly grin, was surprisingly handsome, stately, graceful, and as if he had stepped out of a painted portrait. But there was something sinister and disturbing hidden in his gaze, and Sanya Yoren, despite his good memory, could not understand who was standing in front of him and where this person came from. Her existence, as fate intended, was supposed to be as smooth and peaceful as the calm flow of a forest river, like the carefree rustle of young grass in a gentle breeze on a summer afternoon, or like the quiet rustle of a dragonfly's wings over the surface of a lake. The little girl lowered her head guiltily, clenched her thin fingers, hunched over as if hiding from the world, and, pretending to be calm, barely audibly whispered an apology for not being able to properly introduce herself. After all, she simply had no family, no status, not even a last name. Thoughts wandered in a chaos of guesses. He finally understood that she could not have used her last name when joining the harem, because after losing her past, she was left with only the namelessness with which she was once born, and which she was now forced to bear. She realized with annoyance, bitterness, confusion, and anxiety that she could not remember who was standing in front of her now, as if this person had never appeared in the plot of the novel she had read, as if he had been inserted into her fate by someone from outside, without the author's knowledge. In a rough, harsh tone, standing right at the entrance, the stern man remarked with slight mockery that the palace allocated to the young girl was rather cramped, modest, squalid, and clearly did not correspond to the ideas of luxury befitting a concubine. Putting a long finger to his lips in a gesture of ostentatious politeness, the handsome young man with the graceful bearing declared that, as a concubine of higher rank, he had come here not simply out of curiosity, but to teach the young girl how to properly arrange everything here. In her mind, without showing it, sweet Sanya Yoren thought with suspicion and irritation that apparently the young man had appeared in her chambers not at all for the sake of instructions, but only to provoke a quarrel, start an argument, and put her in an awkward position. The man's hand, confident, strong, impatient, stretched forward, and the guy, looking straight into her eyes, asked with feigned surprise whether she, being a concubine, really did not understand what he was talking about when he mentioned the so-called red flower. The truth was that red flowers, especially symbolic ones, did not bloom for more than 10 days in China. They were fleeting, ephemeral, too sensitive to change, and therefore always served as an allegory for the fragile fate of women. After these words, young Jo Yoon with lazy grace came closer, ran his hand over the lady's cheek, lifted her face, and looking down with haughty coldness, whispered that wilted flowers are not left in a vase, they are torn out of the ground by the roots without regret. After that, with a sly, smug, almost mocking smile, the concubine leaned a little closer and venomously whispered that the imperial palace was no place for wilted, crumbling, fading flowers, because neither compassion nor past beauty were valued here. The girl's face remained cold, calm, absolutely indifferent, as if carved from stone, and not even the slightest hint of fear, anxiety, excitement, confusion, or submission flashed in her gaze. The man made no impression. That is why, instead of being frightened, trembling, screaming, recoiling, or embarrassed, Sanya Yoren, with graceful, polite, impeccably educated restraint, bowed slightly before the arrogant concubine and thanked him for his precious, important advice. Young Jo Yoon, offended by her indifference, having lost interest in the girl for a moment, with a lazy, indifferent, almost tired look, turned his eyes to the modest, silent maid standing to the side, and instantly, decisively, without hesitation, chose her as his target. The man, with a slow, sliding, predatory, and feigned polite smile, asked if this girl was too close to her quiet, devoted, meek servant, and if not, he would like to make one very modest, personal request. Obediently, as if having already resigned herself to her fate, Sanya Yoren calmly asked how she could be of service to the respected concubine, bowed her head with respectful grace, closed her eyes, and concealed the flash of indignation lurking somewhere in the depths of her soul. With a sarcastic, lazy, and mocking half-smile on his lips, Jo Yoon casually said that recently, to his great regret, he had been in dire need of service personnel, especially diligent, silent, and obedient girls. To herself, with all her cold sobriety and inner restraint, Sanya Yoran instantly saw through his lie. The young man clearly occupied a high, honorable, almost privileged position in the palace, had many servants, and now he was lying absolutely brazenly. Jo Yoon was a truly dangerous, insidious, cruel demon in the flesh. His every word was poisoned with falsehood, every smile concealed evil intent, and feigned politeness served only as a mask behind which he hid his predatory face and cynical nature. The young maid, frightened, bewildered, and at a loss to the depths of her soul, stood behind, not daring to move, not knowing what to say, while her mistress, in anxious, painful thought, tried to decide whether to hand the girl over to the stranger. When Sanya Yoren slowly turned to her maid, she shook her head in despair, looking at her mistress in fear, whispering that she did not want to go to a new, unfamiliar, frightening master, with whom a dangerous and humiliating fate could await her. But little Sanya Yoren herself, contrary to expectations, unexpectedly smiled. The one who was supposed to be an ally had long aroused her suspicions, and now the girl was sincerely glad to get rid of the intrusive, suspicious, possibly even spying servant. With such a simple, sophisticated step, the girl simultaneously established and strengthened relations with another influential concubine, and got rid of a source of constant irritation. Cunning combined with composure brought the desired result. Pleased with her dexterity, beautiful as the morning spring, the young girl tightly clenched her fist, feeling an unprecedented relief. She managed to solve two important problems at once, without unnecessary noise, tears, or open conflict, while maintaining her dignity. The cunning maid herself, shocked by the betrayal and deprived of her former confidence, stood aside in complete horror, with a pale face, unable to believe that the young mistress had so easily, cold-bloodedly, and even with a satisfied smile, given her to a stranger. She was shaking with fear, rage, humiliation, and great resentment, like a leaf in a gust of icy wind, and in her eyes, wide open and full of horror, raged a desperate, dark, bitter hatred for her former mistress, who had betrayed her without explanation or regret. The concubine, dressed in expensive silks, tired of empty conversations, with an ingratiating, almost indifferent intonation, again addressed the sweet girl, saying that, alas, it was time for him to leave, because important palace affairs awaited him outside these chambers. Without looking back even once, the stern man left the chambers with the same cold, impenetrable, and arrogant mask on his face, as if neither the girl, nor the maid, nor this episode were worth even a second of his attention, and the whole world outside of his plans was pathetic and insignificant. The little girl held back the large tears, welling up in her eyes, slowly pressed her palm to her burning cheek. Her skin was burning from resentment, from humiliation, from pain, and a prickly, dull determination to remember this moment and the one who had so mercilessly humiliated her settled in the woman's chest. When the handsome man with the piercing, burning gaze finally left the chambers, another man was already waiting for him at the very entrance. A stately man with short scarlet hair, dressed in blue clothes with luxurious trim, thin gold jewelry, and earrings in his ears. With an arrogant, lazy look and a light, caustic mockery on his lips, the man measured his companion with his eyes, after which he venomously said that even here, in a corner of the palace, forgotten by everyone, he managed to meet a useless, worthless non-entity. His name was Garam. The blonde, not paying the slightest attention to the insult, bowed with cold, silent restraint in respectful obeisance to the concubine, whose position was noticeably higher in rank, and then Garam cast a piercing glance into the room behind him. Jo-yoon, who was not used to being ignored, treated with indifference, and especially to not being greeted properly, literally became filled with anger. His face flared up with rage, his eyes lit up, and his breathing became heavy, as if a wild flame of humiliated pride had flared up inside him. Holding back his anger with great effort, he turned sharply to the girl standing silently next to him, in whose eyes neither fear nor guilt was reflected, and in a heavy, irritated tone began to ask sharply what these strange, impudent tricks were that she was allowed to do. He was seething with anger and indignation, noticing that the lovely Sanya Yoran had already ordered another guest to be brought to her, although he himself, young Jo-yoon, had not even left the confines of her room yet, which hurt his pride and caused painful irritation inside. The beautiful Sanya Yoran did not make excuses or try to explain anything. She just lowered her head with exaggerated politeness and gently asked for forgiveness, despite the fact that she did not feel guilty at all and did not consider herself involved in the terrible conflict. Unexpectedly, Garam turned to the blonde with a slight grin, speaking with a lazy but very accurate reproach, expressively noting that he, as always, was going too far, allowing himself too much, and spewing poisonous words in such a refined place as the imperial harem. There had clearly been a major conflict smoldering between these two grown men for a long time. From their tense looks, caustic intonations, and poisonous half-hints, it was clear that behind the polite words, there was a feud that was ready to flare up with renewed vigor at any moment. With an angry expression on his face, the man pointed his finger sharply at everyone present, loudly declaring that such behavior was a real insult to him and that he did not intend to leave this matter without consequences and huge punishment. After this outburst of rage, young Jo-yoon, together with his newfound maid, without deigning to look at anyone else or say a word, turned around and without hiding his irritation, walked away with a heavy gait, leaving the room filled with tension. Sanya Yoran slowly raised her head at the very moment when the charming Garam addressed her, and, opening her expressive eyes wide, she appeared before him in a surprisingly sweet and at the same time truly beautiful and bright appearance, like a morning star. It turned out that this handsome and unusual man had arrived at the palace only to personally see what the new concubine was like, because his piercing indigo eyes and deep red hair were memorable at first sight. However, as it turned out, the handsome Garam had already seen enough. He turned to leave the chambers, and the girl, not wanting to seem rude, bowed to him again with dignity and modesty, expressing graceful, apologetic gratitude for the visit. Mentally consumed with anger, irritation, and despair, she nevertheless could not allow herself to openly object or give a bold rebuff. So all that was left was to politely ask for forgiveness, smile tensely, and pretend to be silly, playing the role of a submissive girl. Before finally leaving, the beautiful Garam looked at her coldly and contemptuously, and then, without hiding his disdain, in a dry voice ordered her not to catch his eye again and not to get underfoot, reminding her of his higher status and power. Almost immediately after the last cold-filled word, the heavy golden silk-lined palace doors slammed shut with a dull echo, as if putting a fat and final point on an unpleasant scene, leaving in the air only silence, irritation, resentment, humiliation, and unspoken annoyance. Having gathered the last bits of will, patience, endurance, anger, and quiet despair, the little girl slowly and tiredly sank down onto the wide bed, spreading her thin, fragile arms out to the sides, as if wanting to forget for a moment, disappear, become invisible and feel nothing for at least a second. Despite the hurt, fear, and anxiety, Sanya Yoran felt a barely noticeable, almost painful relief. Finally, she was alone, without strangers' eyes, and this loneliness suddenly became desirable. She could exhale, close her eyes, and forget for a while. She had already managed to get to know two other concubines of the Empress, whom she had previously known only as characters from a Chinese romantic harem, but now they had become real, living people, with their own character, voice, and quite tangible influence. It was becoming difficult to keep her large eyes open. Fatigue was slowly creeping up on her, making her yawn involuntarily. Her body ached from tension, and her mind was drawn to sleep, dreaming of peace and at least a couple of hours without expectant glances and pretense. However, the peace was short-lived. Footsteps were heard behind the closed carved doors, and soon 3 figures appeared, their silhouettes resembling servants, who loudly and clearly announced that they had come to prepare the concubine's bedroom for sleep, as required by palace regulations. Opening her eyes in surprise and quickly sitting up on the soft bed, the young girl raised her head, peering into the dim light and the silhouettes of the strangers, confusedly asking herself who they were, where they came from, and whether they could be trusted even a little. With doubt and slight surprise, Sanya Yoren watched as one of the maids muttered something in a puzzled tone. Then, as if deciding that there was no point in delaying it any longer, opened the doors and allowed them to enter, preparing for the inevitable process. Following this, more servants began to enter the room, each with red ribbons in their hair, walking in unison, as if they had been prepared in advance for a specific task, and without slowing their pace, they headed towards the girl's bed, already ready to act. The maids, in turn, began to decorate the bed in luxurious, expensive red silks, carefully distributing them over the bed, creating patterns that seemed too pretentious for her modest taste, preparing everything to truly impress. The sweet little girl, unable to understand why the large women's bed was starting to change its color to such a bright and rich red, covered her face with her hand, feeling her discontent growing, not understanding what was hidden behind this unusual and strange decision. Some of the palace maids were quietly talking among themselves, not daring to ask a question, but clearly concerned that the girl did not like the changes in her surroundings, and that perhaps this bright red color was simply not to her liking. They did not dare to intervene. The woman, with obvious confusion in her voice, quickly answered the lady that the room with such luxurious furnishings had been specially prepared for the first wedding night with the Empress, and other options, as it seemed to her, were simply not envisaged at all. Sanya Yoran froze in place in complete horror, feeling as if everything inside her had been torn apart by surprise, and a shudder ran through her body. Her face turned pale, and her eyes reflected a silent shock mixed with confusion, fear, and complete disbelief at what she had heard. A few moments later, as if at a prearranged signal, the maids hastily left the chambers, leaving the girl alone in the midst of luxury, where the silence seemed too resonant, heavy and oppressive on the heated, excited, and frightened imagination. Her head suddenly began to swim, as if the air had become thick and heavy. The girl could not even imagine that the powerful ruler actually wanted to spend the night next to her. This strange thought seemed frightening, impossible, and creepy to her. In the original version of the story, it was repeatedly emphasized that the Empress did not look at Sanya Yoren with romantic interest at all, but rather perceived her as her own daughter, showing only care, affection, warmth, and maternal affection. The little girl, shifting slightly awkwardly from foot to foot, carefully climbed onto the soft, cloud-like bed, deciding to take a nap at least for a little while and allow herself some rest, because the stressful day had completely knocked her out of her strength and upset all her internal feelings, leaving only fatigue. But as soon as she began to feel the sweet and desired sleep, as her eyelids grew heavy and her breathing became calm and measured, the maids entered the room, who calmly but persistently reminded her that first she should definitely take a cleansing bath, because the traditions in the palace could not be broken. The spacious room, decorated in a refined Oriental style, was filled with peace and subtle nobility. Chinese carved furniture made of lacquered wood, smooth walls decorated with paintings, and paper lanterns casting a soft light gave the chambers a sublime atmosphere. On a magnificent throne, towering in the depths of the majestic hall, and decorated with exquisite carvings in the form of dragons and phoenixes, sat Yeva Aryun, the powerful ruler of the empire, dressed in ceremonial robes of scarlet and deep black, symbolizing strength. The woman, with restraint, but with a noticeable shadow of regret, mentally reproached herself for not being able to maintain absolute composure and dispassion, even though only a frightened child stood before her. Her heart trembled, which for an empress was considered weakness. The baby came from an ancient and respected family of Sanya Yoran, and therefore, from the court's point of view, she could well be a potential spy sent on a special mission. Her origins raised reasonable concerns, because the past of the Sanya Yoran family was covered in thick secrets and intrigues. That is why the empress, not wanting to risk the stability of the palace and missing not the slightest detail, sent more of her people to the chambers of the new concubine, ordering them to conduct discreet but careful surveillance of her every step in order to prevent a possible threat. However, despite the internal pain, resentment, confusion, and mistrust, the girl firmly, almost stubbornly, with a dignity unexpected for her age, refused the offered help from the ruler, which led all the courtiers and the empress herself into considerable bewilderment. This behavior confused the woman, because Sanya Yoren seemed like a fragile, lonely, frightened girl who had barely reached adulthood. But in her gaze, one could read hidden strength, stubbornness, determination, and something frighteningly adult, not typical of such a young creature. Suddenly, breaking the prolonged silence, a servant appeared before the woman, silently walked forward with a lowered gaze and caution in every movement, as if she was afraid to disturb the important, heavy thoughts of the empress, immersed in a stream of guesses and gloomy reflections. Kneeling before the majestic ruler, the maid with a deep bow and a restrained voice said that everything had been prepared in advance for the first wedding night, as prescribed by palace custom, requiring precision and strict adherence to rituals. However, she could not help but notice a disturbing detail. The little lady's entire body was covered with many small, barely noticeable scars, which, despite their age, clearly indicated that in the past the girl had been treated cruelly and inhumanely, as if she were an object. The beautiful Yeva Aryun, hearing about this, frowned sympathetically. A heavy irritation flashed in her gaze, because it became obvious. The child had been through a lot, and someone dared to treat her so lowly, leaving traces of pain and great fear on her fragile body. With a dull sound of footsteps and a rustle of clothes, the woman rose from her throne. Her gaze darkened, and without thinking, she firmly and without a shadow of a doubt declared that she intended to personally visit the chambers of her new concubine, to look into her eyes and understand everything. At this time, in the secluded chambers of the palace, enveloped in steam and the aroma of incense, Sanya Yoren was carefully bathed by maids. Warm water gently glided over her fragile body, washing away fatigue and anxiety, and caring hands gently and carefully washed each part, trying not to touch the old scars. Later, in a spacious room with high windows and carved screens, the little girl sat at a large table decorated with fine carvings. Next to her was the empress herself, majestic and calm, pouring clear sake into an elegant porcelain glass with a gold rim. Yeva Aryun, slowly, unhurriedly, with dignity and regal bearing, took the cup with the drink in her hands, brought it to her lips, and took several small, thoughtful sips, as if reflecting on something important, as if each taste reminded her of something from the past. On the table, covered with a silk tablecloth, lay ripe fruits, fresh fruits with pink skin, juicy tangerines, exquisite oriental sweets, shimmering with colors. Everything was served with special care, as if for a holiday. Suddenly, breaking the silence, the lovely Yeva Aryun asked the girl in a calm, but at the same time attentive tone, why she had not yet touched any of the treats, had not drunk any tea, and had not eaten a single piece, despite all the efforts of the cooks and servants. All this time, Yeva Aryun watched the little girl closely, never taking her eyes off her as she slowly sipped her drink, trying to keep her calm from betraying the inner tension that was hidden in her soul under the outer mask of serenity. But looking at the reflection of the drink, the lady could not get rid of the feeling of discontent and internal rejection towards the entire family of aristocrats Sanya Yoran, whose deeds and dark secrets, hidden from prying eyes, increasingly gave rise to vague doubts and anxiety in her soul. Young Sanya Yoran shuddered as she noticed the heavy sigh that escaped from the empress's lips, and feeling the awkwardness in the air, she could not understand why this woman had suddenly changed her mood and what was the cause of her vague uneasiness. The stately woman raised her hand in front of her, taking the exquisite sweetness in it, and with a light sigh said that she had no intention of scaring the little girl or creating an uncomfortable atmosphere, but her actions, it seemed, could not help but leave a mark on her heart. With her Chinese fingers, adorned with thin gold rings, she carefully grabbed the candy, exquisitely shaped like a flower, and, handing it to the girl, suggested that the little one try it, This was supposed to be not only a treat, but also a gesture designed to strengthen trust. After that, the woman, with a slight smile, began to explain to the girl that this candy was honey, with nuts baked in a thin caramel, and that its taste was unique. Such a delicacy that could only be truly enjoyed by those who appreciate exquisite treats. Meanwhile, the girl did not have time to notice how a whole mountain of sweets appeared on her plate, which Yeva Aryan generously served her, creating a real feast of delicious treats, despite her inner anxiety and bewilderment about this excess. Sanya Yoran frowned, lost in thought as to how it could have happened that so many sweet treats had fit inside her, and wondered if this was some kind of hidden punishment from the older woman she still somehow didn't trust. Initially, the sweet little girl often suffered from hunger, being forced to hide from everyone and hide, so all this time, lying in bed without strength, she sought salvation in simple joys, such as food, in order to forget at least a little and distract herself from the horrors of her secret past. Frowning but determined, the young girl reached with her chopsticks for the grapes that lay at the very top of the mountain of treats, deciding to start with that, hoping that at least this fruit would taste good and not cause any unpleasant sensations. She carefully put the fruit in her cheek, slowly tasting it, hoping to enjoy the sweet taste, but as soon as the grape touched her tongue, she immediately winced. The fruit was bitter, so bitter that her face contorted with an unpleasant sensation, leaving her with only disappointment. Suddenly, the girl grimaced sharply, trying not to spit out the grapes, which turned out to be so bitter that her face was distorted by the taste, and she barely restrained the desire to get rid of this fruit, which brought her only disappointment. The bitterness was felt so strongly that her eyes filled with tears. Sanya Yoran began to cough loudly, quickly covering her mouth with her hands, trying to hold back the painful attacks. However, despite her efforts, the juice from the grapes poured out, dripping onto the table and leaving behind an unpleasant trace of bitterness and embarrassment. The Empress, hearing the girl's loud cough, shuddered. Her face immediately darkened, and she frowned, not expecting that the little girl would become ill from a simple fruit that she considered safe and even beneficial for her health, and this instantly made her think about the consequences. The girl trembled in horror, looking at the grape juice that slowly flowed down her face and hands, feeling the cold sweat covering her forehead from fear. The woman's eyes widened in panic, and the noblewoman could not understand what was happening, losing control of herself. Immediately, the lovely Empress jumped up from her seat, screaming in horror for a doctor, and her voice sounded frightened. She assumed that it could be poisoning, which only aggravated her anxiety because the consequences could be very serious. The bitterness that still hadn't gone away made the girl's nose hurt, and she couldn't speak normally. Her words came out with difficulty. Her breathing became more and more intermittent, and her body continued to tremble with fear and pain, which worried those around her even more. There were quick footsteps, and another person entered the room. A man in a white coat, with a medical instrument in his hands, ready to help. His face expressed concern, and he immediately took action, without wasting a second, to provide the necessary assistance. This strange man was dressed in a magnificent golden hanfu. His hair was shining like jewels. His teeth were clenched tightly, as if he was holding back a storm of emotions. His gaze was full of determination, and his every gesture indicated that he was ready to carry out an important mission. He barbarously burst inside, as if he knew that he had come at the call of the ruler herself, and his determination was obvious, because he understood that much depended on his actions, and the anxiety that reigned in the air only strengthened his determination. Sanya Yoran and Yeva Aryun stood motionless, their bodies frozen in anxious and tense anticipation, as if something important and inevitable was about to happen, and their eyes met. Both felt a threat hanging in the air, a harbinger of trouble that was gripping their hearts. The young maiden's face was stained, expressing deep horror and anxiety when she realized who exactly had appeared in their room, and her eyes widened in fear and surprise when the one who could influence the fate of everyone who was nearby and change everything came. It was Miran Aryun, the Empress's wise and experienced advisor, dressed in a magnificent outfit that emphasized his high position and status, and he looked worried, with anxiety on his face, because there was a serious threat that his ruler could be poisoned, and he was obliged to act immediately to prevent disaster. The young man was running as fast as he could down the long corridor, his footsteps echoing, when suddenly an alarming call was heard, echoing throughout the building, and his heart began to beat faster. His legs seemed to not obey him, but he rushed towards the room, feeling that something terrible and extremely important was happening right now. A new environment opened up before him. Red curtains, shimmering in the dim light, sliding across the floor like shadows, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty, as if the walls themselves were whispering that there was an invisible danger hidden here that he needed to understand. Miran Aryun was furious when he learned that someone had dared to try to poison the sweet and inviolable Empress right in his presence, and this insolence awakened in him a terrible, all-consuming evil, because he never forgave such actions, especially when they concerned the closest ones. Having seized the controlled evil, he threw open the doors with a furious growl, breaking the silence, and, not holding back his anger and inner turmoil, he rudely asked what had happened, trying to comprehend how such terrible events could have happened in this sacred and protected place. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, his face reflected bewilderment and shock when he realized what was happening inside, and his mouth fell open in surprise and anxiety, as if the world itself was collapsing before him, and he did not know how to act further, did not know what to do with this chaos and danger. Inside the room was the Empress herself, and next to her stood Sanya Yoren, whose face was stained with grape juice, which seemed so bright against her pale skin, as if it were some kind of symbol or mark that should not be forgotten, warning of possible danger. The man stepped towards the ruler, his gaze full of anxiety and determination, and she, despite her obvious concern, answered him that she was fine. But the girl standing next to him was in much worse shape and clearly needed urgent help, which made him even more worried. With her hand, she gently pushed the young girl towards the head doctor, who was standing a little further away, and the girl, trembling with fear, went to meet help, as if she herself did not believe that this was happening, and did not know what to do in such a stressful situation. Suddenly, a servant entered, following the doctor, and loudly said that he had lost his bandage while hurrying along the corridor, and now his eyes, red and wild, with sharp pupils, became visible to everyone, which attracted attention and caused even more anxiety among those present. The young man turned back, cursing mentally, because the new danger had revealed his secret, which he had tried so hard to hide from everyone, and now the consequences of this step could be much more serious than he could have imagined in his worst assumptions. The blood of a snake ran through his body, and the scales that covered his skin glittered in the dim light, giving him a sinister and mysterious appearance. He looked not like a man, but like something far more ancient and dangerous than any mortal, unimaginably alien and powerful. Miran Aryun, overcome with anxiety, began to cover his eyes with a ribbon again, hiding his emotions and not giving himself a chance to be vulnerable, while Sanya Yoren, looking at him in bewilderment, noticed that she still had not asked how to greet the concubine who had arrived and what to do in this situation. As suddenly, the man, with genuine force, placed his hand on her forehead, making a gesture that was hard and decisive, as if he wanted to make her understand that now was not the time for doubts and hesitations, and everything that was happening was only a small part of a larger plan. After which the man said angrily that she must choose, whether she would prefer death by poisoning or remain without a head, and the girl recoiled in fear, feeling the full weight of these words on herself, as if death itself was standing nearby, ready to take her away. She felt as if she had fallen into the trap of a snake, which was wrapping its coils around her, squeezing her tighter and tighter, and not giving her a single chance of salvation. Her fragile heart was beating wildly in her chest, and she understood that she could not get out of this grip. The dangerous wild snake, like an anaconda, embraced the beauty in its strong embrace, holding her tightly, and the girl realized that this moment had become for her not just a test of endurance, but a real trap from which she might never escape. And now this reptile, ready to devour her, showed its sharp and dangerous fangs, and Sanya Yoren trembled with fear, feeling how her body was paralyzed by horror before the inevitable danger, which seemed too close to avoid it or change anything. The lovely lady kept her head bowed as the physician, after careful examination, gave his verdict. She was not poisoned, but simply the grapes were too bitter for her, which at first seemed incredible, but fortunately turned out to be true. The Empress breathed a sigh of relief at the news, Her tense muscles relaxed, and she felt the world return to its place again, albeit with the clear awareness of how thin the line between life and death was in her situation and in her surroundings. The adults started talking about children, about how they often prefer sweet things while they treat sour and bitter things with obvious disgust, and questions were raised about upbringing, preferences, and reactions to tastes, sometimes completely unpredictable. But in the original, Miran Aryun was one of the most cunning and mean characters, and when he found out that Sanya Yorn had died, he just said, "What a pity," saying these words without the slightest expression of regret, as if her death had absolutely no meaning to him, and still. Initially, this character was not a human, but a dragon, and this was his main secret, which he carefully hid from everyone so as not to arouse suspicion and not to reveal his true nature, which gave him even more mystery and danger, regardless of how he manifested himself. Sanya Yoren bowed her head in resignation, feeling despair growing in her heart, because she realized that now nothing could be changed, and all her thoughts were only about death, which seemed to be about to take her away, leaving a woman's fragile life in the shadow of a terrible tragedy. The Empress asked the sweet girl if she could eat anything else besides the berries, to which she apologized, explaining that it was too late for food, and her body simply could not perceive anything else except the bitterness of the moment she had experienced, which she would not forget. The lady nodded understandingly and stated that, yes, it really was the most appropriate time for sleep, because the tension and worries definitely required recovery, and it would be best to do this in peace and quiet, without unnecessary worries and all other anxieties. The maids began to stir quietly and carry candles, fruits, and other items around the room to create an atmosphere of comfort and calm, hoping to relax those present a little and give them the time to rest that they so needed after everything that had happened. The girl herself, staggering from fatigue, could barely stay on her feet, trying with all her might to cope with the growing feeling of drowsiness that was overcoming her, and she felt how her body was becoming heavy and her eyes were closing, barely allowing her to see her surroundings. Sleepily, with difficulty, the little girl rubbed her eyes with her fist, trying to drive away the sleep that was becoming more and more unbearable with each passing moment. Her body protested, but she still held back, trying not to fall asleep right there, standing as if trying to win. Handsome Mirin Aryun, watching her condition with surprise, turned his attention to the girl whose body was already on the verge of losing balance. He could not help but notice how she was barely staying on her feet, almost losing consciousness from the fatigue that overcame her. The girl, unable to hold on any longer, was losing strength with each passing moment. Her eyes were opening with difficulty, and her body was on the verge of falling, as if it had lost all support. Sleep was covering her, and despite all her efforts, she could no longer stand. Her fragile body began to give in. He, noticing her helplessness, did not lose his head, and instantly picked her up in his arms, trying to hold her in his arms so as not to let her fall onto the hard and cold floor. His feelings were overflowing with care, and he carefully pressed her to himself, trying to ease her suffering and support her. Sanya Yoren, jumping up in surprise, instantly opened her eyes, because she absolutely did not expect that someone would pick her up in his arms, and now, feeling his support, she was confused, not knowing how to react to such an unexpected manifestation of care and attention, which she could neither understand nor accept immediately. Miran Aryun, as if nothing had happened, despite the threats and the tense atmosphere he had created earlier, held her in his arms with such ease as if he was not the person who had once threatened her, smiling caringly, and his face expressed a sincere desire to protect her at that moment. The boy was incredibly tall, and when the little girl, barely containing her excitement and anxiety, looked down, her gaze slid over the semi-dark space, where the floor seemed distant and endless, as if the whole room and the world around were too big for her. After that, she was carefully and lovingly carried to the bed, almost as if in hands, and she felt her body being absorbed into the soft red sheets that gently wrapped around her, giving her a feeling of peace and comfort, where she could completely relax, forget about all her worries, and feel safe. Miran Aryun, understanding the girl's condition, said in a light and gentle tone that Sanya Yoren was probably very tired, and perhaps could no longer withstand the tension and stress, so she needed to rest and regain her strength as soon as possible in order to be back on her feet. Feeling awkward in this situation, the girl carefully sat up on the bed, realizing that she would now be perceived as a small child, despite her desire to look like an adult, and this realization was new and rather strange for her, causing internal embarrassment. They carefully grabbed the little girl by her graceful feet to take off her pink shoes, and despite her slight embarrassment and awkwardness, everything happened so carefully and calmly that she could not object, although she was not accustomed to such care and attention. The Empress, with a kind and caring smile, helped the little girl take off her shoes, understanding that this could be an important moment for the girl, and she tried to create an atmosphere of warmth and comfort so that the little girl would feel calm and protected, as if in her own home. The young girl, stunned and a little confused, sat on the bed, not believing that someone would suddenly treat her so sincerely and caringly, because in her life there were so few moments when someone showed attention and tenderness to her, and she could not understand why. These two adults behaved with her so friendly and openly, as if she was not just a stranger's child, but someone very important to them, and she could not understand how in such a cruel world they could so sincerely and freely protect her, without expecting anything in return. And so the little girl, holding back her excitement and feeling an unprecedented confidence for her, said that she was very grateful to them for their help, but now she could cope on her own, which surprised the adults with her unexpected refusal, which sounded too adult for her age and situation. They looked at each other warily, realizing that this behavior was completely unusual for her, as if the girl had suddenly lost her childish naivety and began to behave in a restrained, intelligent, and adult manner, which caused them slight concern. The pink shoes remained lying on the soft bed, forgotten and unnoticed, as a symbol of the fact that the little girl had changed a little in her perception of the world and began to look at it from a different point of view than before, discovering something new for herself. A lovely night had come, and the dark sky, strewn with stars, covered everything around, plunging into deep silence and stillness, where only a quiet wind reminded that life goes on, despite all the worries and experiences that were in the air. The servant hurriedly followed behind the young master, who looked incredibly elegant in his blue hanfu, with his golden hair fluttering in the wind, reflecting the light and creating an aura of mystery, as if he was not just a man, but a majestic being. The young man was shocked by his own actions, by the way he cared for another concubine who was essentially supposed to be his rival. And despite his tamed cruelty, he couldn't help but feel like his heart suddenly fluttered at that moment. The girl had legs that were too thin and emaciated, barely able to support her, and shoes that seemed too small, inhumanly squeezing her toes, which added to her vulnerability, as if she was on the verge of collapsing under the weight of everything. The beautiful lady froze in horror when her gaze met the guy's real eyes, which were full of dark, incomprehensible horror, and, realizing that he was much more dangerous than she could have imagined, the woman's heart sank with fear, as if death itself was standing nearby. Very soon, the sweet little girl, as if succumbing to fatigue and wanting to get rid of all the surrounding worries and cares, began to doze off right on the go, her body losing support, and her eyes began to close, as if she was looking for salvation in simply forgetting herself. But the man, even fully concentrating on what was happening, could not understand how the lady managed to come to her senses so quickly and take control of the situation again, as if the vulnerability she had recently shown had instantly evaporated, and she had returned to her previous form. The night was full of mysterious calm. The moon softly illuminated the dark sky, and the stars, like eternal witnesses of time, scattered across the sky, creating a charming picture that beckoned with its grandeur and boundless calm, absorbing all worries. The concubine, remaining motionless for a moment, stopped to enjoy the silence of the night, watching the moon reflect its light on the dark expanses, feeling the world around him freeze in this magical moment where everything disappears except these silent witnesses. Meanwhile, in the Empress's room, where silence reigned, the girl Sanya Yorin slept peacefully in the same bed with a woman. Their bodies were surrounded by the soft light of the night, and the air itself was full of warmth and tranquility, as if it was a place where all worries disappeared, and the world was in complete peace. The little girl, feeling anxious, was afraid to fall asleep, knowing that her strange nighttime habits could cause trouble, and was worried that she might offend the ruler, leaving her in terrible anxiety, not realizing that she might not notice anything. Suddenly, unable to bear the silence of the night, the woman sat down on the edge of the bed, looked at the sleeping girl, and, despite her fatigue, allowed herself to think for a moment, realizing that her heart was filled with excitement and sympathy for this helpless creature. Sanya Yoran, feeling anxiety grip her heart, carefully turned over in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, and closed her eyes again, as if she was seeking peace in her thoughts, hoping that everything would be fine and she would be able to find answers to her questions. Adult Yiva Aryun, with slight concern, leaned over the girl, placing her hand on her small head, stroking her hair, feeling the girl's warm breath gently touch her skin, and tried to convey to her care and sense of security. The Empress, looking at the beautiful girl with a surprisingly soft and gentle look, said that the girl was poor, and in her eyes there was so much compassion and love that it seemed as if all the tenderness and desire to protect her from all troubles was hidden in this look. The girl, with difficulty opening her sleepy eyes, barely blinked them, trying to get rid of the heavy eyelids that seemed to be pulling her into an endless sleep. But she still tried to wake up, although the world around her was becoming more and more blurry, not giving her the opportunity to get rid of great fatigue. The ruler, feeling her responsibility for the girl, often extended her helping hand with sincere sympathy, repeatedly showing that she was ready to support her in any difficult situation, despite her power and the coldness hidden behind her images. The girl's thoughts, despite the touch of a gentle hand, involuntarily turned to the fact that even if there had not been this care, her desire to survive and overcome all the trials of the palace and the empire was so strong that she would have coped in any case, without losing any hope. The large sky, illuminated by the soft light of the morning sun, covered with clouds, gave the whole world a feeling of freshness and newness, promising a new day in which the girl could again hope for the best, despite the difficulties and hardships that surrounded her. The sweet little girl, despite her sleep-deprived body and fatigue, still continued to rub her eyes, trying to find at least some relief from the heaviness of sleep. But her restless mind and body did not allow her to immerse herself in the long-awaited rest, despite all her efforts. Sanya Yoran, slightly alarmed, noticed that Yeva Aryun had left before dawn, and now the place next to her on the bed was empty, leaving only traces of the night's worries and the silence that filled the room, like the night silence after the rain that filled the space around. The pink dress, fluttering beautifully at the seams, attracted the attention of all the servants in the palace, who came in to help the new concubine dress, carefully preparing her as if it were an important ritual in which every gesture was thought out to the smallest detail. A hand with long scars that testified to a hard life took a white cloth and rinsed it thoroughly in water, absorbing the moisture before carefully continuing to care for the girl who needed to be helped through this day full of challenges and unfamiliar circumstances. Two maids carefully looked after the girl. One helped the girl wash herself, gently wiping her face from sleep, and the other offered her a morning drink that was supposed to wake her up and give her strength to meet the new day with renewed energy. In the hands of the maid was a bowl with a mysterious drink, which looked quite appetizing. Its aroma was pleasant and made the girl feel how her fatigue gradually receded, but at the same time she could not help but notice its strange, unusual shade. The young maid, dressed in a pink dress, was so optimistic that she smiled and confidently declared that this drink had been prepared with special care just for her, hoping that it would give her strength and vigor to start the day with ease and freshness. The little girl, frowning and feeling a strange taste in her mouth, almost regretfully but resolutely asked to add at least a little honey, hoping that such sweetness, even if small, would soften the bitterness of the drink, making it at least a little more pleasant. The lady, hearing the little girl's request, froze for a moment. Her eyes expressed deep surprise, and then her face lit up with a warm and soft expression, barely hiding her affection for how the little lady was already taking care of her own comfort with such confidence despite her youth. The maid, without losing a minute, instantly ran out of the room to find honey. Her steps were so fast that the air around her seemed light and cool, and the promise to return with honey sounded like a confident oath, and she strove to fulfill the request as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, While the young maids were wiping the clever girl's face with a soft cloth, her thoughts were full of bitter reflection. Perhaps she had asked in vain to add honey, and now her small request would only complicate the process, becoming an extra reason for concern. The servants stood transfixed, in tense anticipation, watching their little mistress with curiosity and caution as she tasted the drink they had so painstakingly prepared for her, not knowing how she would react to this surprise, especially given her delicate preferences. The lady frowned, trying to hide her displeasure, as the sweetness of the drink was too much for her refined tastes, and she had to restrain herself from spitting it out, tasting its cloying sweetness that was too rich for her refined perception. With a sparkle in her eyes and hope that the drink would still be suitable, the maid, with a touched expression on her face, quietly asked if the lady liked the drink, sincerely wishing that everything would be the best, and that she would feel comfort and pleasure from every drop. Suddenly, the little girl, as if unable to restrain herself from an impulse, jumped sharply off the bed and, landing loudly and abruptly on the floor, hit the hard surface with her feet with a dull thud, attracting the attention of the entire room and everyone present with her unexpected action. After this, as if justifying her unexpected act, the girl confidently and decisively declared that she would like to go for a walk, not paying attention to what had just happened, and impatiently waited for permission to fulfill her impulse, feeling a slight anxiety. The little girl, fully aware that she had to be on guard and careful, realized that among the other concubines, there might be those who were ready to weave various intrigues and plot against her, which put her in a vulnerable position and required special caution. That is why she thought that if the palace were suddenly under attack, she should be prepared for any outcome and think in advance about possible escape routes so that she could escape if necessary, always having a plan in case of an emergency. Despite all this, sadness overcame the lady when she remembered that her original intentions were full of the desire to explore and learn, but all this changed after she accidentally encountered a dragon, which changed her life and filled her with anxiety. Now, realizing the seriousness of the situation, she knew that the stern man with red eyes would not leave her alone because she saw his true nature, and this made her completely helpless, because he would surely be watching her every step. The noblewoman's gaze darted to her servants, and without hiding her anxiety, she quietly asked if she could leave the walls of the imperial palace without risking her safety, because her further actions must be thought out and as careful as possible to avoid possible dangers. The maid, with luxurious raven-black hair, styled in a smooth bun, replied with a polite half-smile on her lips that her mistress had no need to ask permission at all, since she had the right to move freely throughout the entire palace at any time convenient for her. The young girl, looking down and biting her lips slightly from slight embarrassment, quietly uttered a request to teach her the intricacies of palace etiquette, because, having been here quite recently, she felt insecure and had little understanding of the customs, rules, and refined traditions of the refined place. The maids, bowing their heads in unison in a polite bow, meekly explained that the dear lady was allowed to visit almost all parts of the palace, except for a few strictly guarded enclosed areas, such as the library, the imperial garden, and the private quarters of high-ranking persons. For Sanya Yoren, who had been brought up in a strict and restrictive environment, the news that she could freely walk around most of the vast palace complex was a revelation and a surprise to the core, as she had sincerely believed that she was bound by rules and boundaries. A warm fur cape of a soft pink color, with golden embroidery along the edge, was carefully and with visible care thrown over her fragile shoulders, so that the young concubine would not freeze in the cool morning air and would not catch a cold from the cold drafts in the stone halls of the palace. Slowly, with a slight creak and an almost solemn sound, the huge carved doors of the main palace swung majestically open, letting in a stream of cool morning air, and with it a feeling of novelty, change, and something unknown but alluring. Sanya Yoren, with a determination surprising for her young age, with a firm, calm, and focused look in the depths of her shining eyes, confidently took a step forward, as if entering not just marble halls, but a new destiny, full of trials and discoveries. She carefully, with small, childish, and still slightly uncertain, but determined steps, began to descend the wide and majestic staircase leading down to the bright galleries, ceremonial halls, and endless corridors with high ceilings. The further she walked, the higher and more grandiose the staircase that was left behind seemed, and it seemed that there were not just many steps, but thousands. And with each new step, the girl's heart was increasingly filled with anxious delight and sweet anticipation of the unknown. The maids, who remained a little behind, watched their young mistress with tenderness and maternal affection. She was so touchingly fragile, graceful, full of inner light, and her fragile figure, lost in the spacious halls, resembled a fragile bud in spring. A small foot in an elegant slipper with dragon embroidery carefully stepped onto the cool grass, damp with morning dew, and her toes felt the softness of the earth, mixed with fragile rustling leaves, spreading out like a colorful carpet under the woman's feet. Sweet Sanya Yoran slowly walked out into the backyard of the palace, where the entire space was filled with the lively, almost fairy tale silence of autumn. Trees with golden and crimson foliage swayed in the wind, mossy stones lay in the corners, and the air was fragrant with fading but enchanting nature. The girl carefully made her way through the branches, between the bushes, tall grasses and smooth trunks, dodging low-hanging leaves. And in this silence of nature, something unexpected, strangely bright and amazingly beautiful, suddenly attracted her attention, like an invisible call. Stopping in surprise in the middle of the garden path, she froze in place, like a statuette, holding her breath, and her large eyes opened wide with sincere amazement, quiet delight, and slight trepidation, as if she saw a real fairy tale that suddenly came to life before her. Under the spreading crown of an ancient moss-covered tree, whose roots went deep into the ground, where the shade was especially thick, delicate pink flowers suddenly stretched upward from the grass, trembling in the wind, fragile, shining, completely out of place in this late, almost fading autumn. Without thinking twice and giving in to a sudden burst of playful inspiration, the little girl deftly, almost like a cat, climbed onto a low branch of an old tree with wide, spreading crowns, made herself comfortable, and, sighing blissfully, lay down to rest, as if this were her favorite place in the world. With a genuine, truly happy smile on her face, she spread her arms out to the sides, allowing the wind to play freely with the long sleeves of her robe, and her gaze to slide freely over the blue sky, grasses, flowers, and foliage, enjoying the peace and beauty of her surroundings. There was a bewitching, almost magical harmony of nature all around. A high azure sky, across which fluffy clouds floated lazily, the ground strewn with bright flowers, rare gusts of wind stirring the crown, and the leisurely breathing of the forest, filled with the aroma of autumn. But even the warm fur mantle that the maids had thoughtfully thrown over her in the morning could not completely protect her from the persistent autumn chill. The wind crept under the fabric, tickled her delicate skin, causing the girl to shudder, press herself against a branch, and shrink from the cold. And suddenly, completely unexpectedly, in this enchanting silence, cautious steps were heard, the muffled crunch of leaves, the light sound of approaching steps, as if someone was leisurely walking straight towards her, not knowing that a little girl was hiding under the tree. The girl shuddered when she realized that she was no longer alone. Her eyes widened, and she froze in surprise, feeling how the world around her suddenly changed. The illusions disappeared, and before her was a dark, gloomy forest, in which she did not recognize a single familiar tree, nor a familiar sound. The illusions dissipated, and she found herself in a dense forest, in dark, almost frightening nooks and crannies, where cold, foggy rays of light barely made their way through the dense foliage, and her gaze darted around in search of at least some way to get out of this strange, disturbing place. From the darkness of the forest emerged the figure of a man, a long blade gleaming on his belt, the gleam of its metal reflected in the dim light, creating an ominous contrast that made the girl feel a sudden surge of horror, because she knew for sure that this was not just a random traveler. The stern man moved towards her slowly but surely, as if he knew that she could not escape. And looking at his cold expression, the lovely Sanya Yoran realized that perhaps he was sent to kill her, and his intentions did not bode well. Without thinking or wasting a second, Sanya Yoran jumped down from the tree in a panic, her heart pounding and fear for her life paralyzing her every move. She could not afford to slow down as the danger was too close, and trembling with fear, she rushed to the side to save herself. The young man followed her quickly, his strong hand frozen at his belt where his sword hung, ready to come out of its sheath at any moment, and his every step sounded like a harbinger of imminent danger. He took his time, as if he was sure that she would not be able to escape. Suddenly, as the girl took a step, a sharp, unbearable pain pierced her legs, and she almost lost her balance, as if the very ground beneath her was opening up, not allowing her to hold on in this world full of horror and mortal threat, which suddenly became her terrible reality. Unable to stop herself from falling, Sanya Yoren was unable to stay on her feet, and, unable to avoid the inevitable, fell to the ground with a dull thud. Her hands met the cold and damp earth, covered with dirt and wet leaves, and the painful blow to her hips left a deep mark, reminding her of the inevitability of fear. The young girl sat on the ground, trembling with fear, feeling her heart beating in her chest, feeling death approaching her, and it seemed that her time was almost up, because the steps of this stranger were approaching, and the noblewoman understood that her life was hanging by a thread. The good noblewoman tried to rise, but horror and fear paralyzed her body. Every muscle resisted, and the trembling that gripped her did not give her the slightest chance of movement. Her legs did not obey, and she was completely overcome with helplessness and hopelessness. The man, confidently and unhurriedly approaching her, froze next to her, as if deciding what to do with this helpless creature. His shadow fell on the girl, absorbing her like an ominous sign, causing her heart to beat faster, and her thoughts to blur in anxiety, as if the darkness itself had come for her. It was Garam, a concubine with fiery red hair and a wild look in his eyes that seemed to notice nothing around him except the girl, his eyes blazing with insane determination, and she felt his gaze piercing her to the very depths, consuming her like fire consumes everything in its path. Suddenly, with a wave of his hand, he summoned a bright flame in front of him, which flared up instantly, and its tongues of fire instantly enveloped the space around, filling the air with heat and an eerie light, ready to engulf everything that would be in its path, as if fate had compressed itself into one moment. The flames shot up, burning everything in their path, and now she no longer had a single safe path to escape. She realized that the fire surrounded her from all sides, and there was no way out except to stand in front of this hell face to face, feeling how the heat radiated more and more with each passing second. They found themselves in the very heart of the forest, where only the furious tongues of flame illuminated the space, and there was not a single saving path around. And the girl realized that her fate was now decided by this fierce fire, which was impossible to fight, and only fear remained her only companion. The man frowned and, slowly approaching the girl, looked at her carefully. His gaze was cold and assessing, as if he was trying to understand what was happening in this restless and frightened mind, as if he knew what the girl was going through at the moment. Sweet Sanya Yoren, unable to contain her feelings, began to cry. Her tears flowed down her cheeks, and with trembling lips, she sobbed, whispering, begging the guy not to kill her, not to end her existence in this cruel and crazy world, full of fear and pain. The handsome concubine, watching the girl in surprise, suddenly froze, not understanding what she was even talking about, his face distorted in bewilderment, and he asked with slight irritation, as if she lacked the intelligence to understand what was happening in their dangerous and unknown world. There was an awkward pause, during which the young man asked again, with obvious displeasure, what kind of nonsense this girl had just blurted out. Her words sounded so ridiculous that he could hardly believe that they were coming from her, so scared and innocent, as if she did not realize the full danger. Strong Garam, having relaxed a little, sat down next to the little girl, and finally calmly said that he had not even thought about killing her, wondering why he would need to do this at all, considering that her life did not pose any threat to him, but only aroused curiosity. Sanya Yoran froze in surprise, her mind momentarily unable to comprehend what was happening, and her heart pounding so hard that she felt like it was about to burst out of her chest, and she was ready, almost automatically, to beg for mercy, feeling completely helpless.
Suddenly, as if something had changed in his mood, the man with a wire button, his thing ringing silent, his weapons fell to the ground. If he acknowledged defenselessness before her, his gesture was an unusual sign of trust.
After the weapons rolled across the grass, Garam took his time expressing his belief that perhaps it was enough, that he had gotten rid of all his weapons for her sake, now remaining unarmed, as if that created a new dynamic in their interaction. With tears in her eyes, Sanya Yoren, unable to contain the emotions that had surged through her, nodded quietly, as if confirming that she was no longer afraid of his gesture, that she was ready to trust his words, believing that this moment would somehow be able to change their relationship for the better. However, despite her weak confirmation, the young man, clutching his head in utter despair, cursed himself, realizing that everything had not gone as he had planned, and the situation had become much more complicated than he could have expected, leaving him in a state of complete confusion and inner embarrassment. After that, with obvious concern and slight excitement, he carefully asked her if she was very scared, because in his opinion, she almost fell, rushing to run away from him, which caused him a feeling of awkwardness, guilt, and regret for what happened, as if his actions led to such consequences. Having received no answer to his question, the young man, a little worried by the silence, again tried to find out what exactly made her react so strongly, and immediately, without wasting time, the girl bowed to him as a sign of respect, asking for forgiveness for her words and actions. The man, noticing her humility, awkwardly looked away and, slightly stuttering, asked her not to apologize, because it was he who was at fault before her, and this time it was he who should apologize for his actions and words that so hurt the fragile female soul. He explained with a slight sigh that he had come not only to apologize to the girl, but also to return her old maid, hoping that this would at least slightly atone for his mistakes and help to mend the relationship that he had so badly damaged with his behavior. The girl, having deeply thanked the man for his help and support, could not get rid of disturbing thoughts, mentally drawing not the best words, because she had put so much effort into finding out about the spy. But he had returned her back, leaving her in complete confusion. When the concubine, with anxiety in his voice, carefully asked if she was angry with him for what had happened, the calm Sanya Yoren, with a slight smile, full of confidence, answered that she was not angry at all, and, on the contrary, felt grateful for his help, despite the absurdity of the situation. Suddenly, the voices of the maids were heard, and the little girl, in panic and alarm, cried out loudly that they had already begun to look for her, realizing that her absence could cause anxiety and fear in those who were dear to her, which only increased her growing anxiety. The maid, overcome with terrible fear and complete panic, rushed through the thick bushes with a loud scream and quickly reached the couple sitting in a secluded corner, hidden from prying eyes, in complete despair, trying to attract their attention and help, not understanding what was happening. However, upon seeing the picture, the lady froze, shocked and dumbfounded. Her mistress was not alone. Next to her was another concubine, dressed in a dark cape, and at that moment, she could hardly believe what she saw with her own eyes, overcome with anxiety and confusion. Agitated and restless, the maid rushed to the little girl and, with anxiety in her voice, asked how she had managed to avoid serious injuries, because there were traces of dirt on the girl's body, although she seemed unharmed and uninjured, which seemed surprising. The beautiful lady's clothes, a woman's cape, were covered in a layer of dirt and dust, as if she had been wading through a storm, and every stain on the fabric was a reminder of a long and difficult journey that had left an indelible mark on her appearance and aura, leaving a sense of disaster and poor fate. Looking away and feeling an unpleasant sense of guilt wash over her, Sanya Yoren sincerely apologized for getting her clothes dirty, but her words were unconvincing as the worry and confusion in her eyes were obvious, and she still felt deeply awkward. Suddenly, the maid, gently and lovingly embracing the little girl, assured her that now everything would be fine and she would not suffer anymore, bringing comfort to her soul like a warm light that was supposed to drive away all fears and return the long-awaited peace to her heart. After this, the servant, filled with sincere gratitude, expressed his appreciation to the concubine for helping them find the baby, thanking him for not leaving them in their difficult moment and doing everything possible to return the girl to their hands, despite the dangers. With surprise in her eyes, Sanya Yoren turned around and, feeling some strange anxiety, asked what happened, trying to understand why Garam had suddenly spoken in his confusing words, leaving a feeling of slight uncertainty and confusion in her soul. Oh, realizing that she had said too much, the girl bowed slightly with respect and apologized, feeling how awkwardness from her words instantly overwhelmed her, while the man, immersed in deep thought, thoughtfully settled down among the weapons that he had previously carefully scattered on the grass. Soon, unexpectedly and rather abruptly, the man extended his hand to the girl, as if offering her something important and valuable, as if this strange gesture contained a special meaning that the sweet beauty had to understand, or somehow realize its significance. Sanya Yoren thought about it, trying to understand what exactly he wanted from her at that moment, and how he managed to change his behavior so abruptly. Suddenly it dawned on her. A thought pierced her head like lightning, and she realized that his intentions were much more complex than she could have imagined. The girl, as if hoping for something important, reached for the weapon. Her small hands with difficulty grabbed the shuriken, blade, and dagger, and she felt how the heavy weapon in her hands became unusually heavy, despite its true weight, which added to her excitement. Slowly and carefully, with great confusion and anxiety in her eyes, the girl handed all this to the guy, her small hands trembling with tension, and the guy sitting next to her suddenly froze. His face became surprised, as if he expected something completely different. Garam froze. His body seemed to be paralyzed, and in the oppressive silence that fell at that moment, his eyes widened, reflecting complete bewilderment and deep surprise at what had just happened, as if his mind could not comprehend what had happened. Sanya Yoren, who was standing to the side, simultaneously flinched in surprise when the guy screamed in panic that he didn't mean it at all, and then recoiled, as if realizing that what was happening had gone completely in the wrong direction and was not at all what she expected. Garam, not immediately getting over the awkward moment, coughed, his words slurred, and he stuttered as he tried to apologize and explain that he had absolutely not meant to scare the girl again, feeling the tension and embarrassment take over him as he tried to find the right words to calm her down. Blushing in embarrassment, the strong Garam, with obvious embarrassment, finally expressed his gratitude to the little girl for handing him the weapon, his voice trembling with awkwardness, and a wave of gratitude was growing inside, which he could not hide, feeling guilty. Sanya Yoren, who was standing nearby and watching everything that was happening, was stunned, not understanding what was happening, why the concubine was acting so strangely, as if something was wrong with him, and the thought arose that perhaps he had eaten something wrong for breakfast that caused such a reaction. Silence hung between them, and the silence around them seemed to envelop them, absorbing all the sounds of the forest, creating a strange atmosphere in which everyone was absorbed in their own thoughts and trying to understand what was happening at this moment. As if the whole world around froze, and the air became heavy. Vaguely justifying himself, the handsome Garam walked away, feeling how awkwardness continued to follow him, like a heavy burden that he could not throw off, not understanding how to truly and unmistakably get rid of this awkward feeling that constantly hinders him. Suddenly, the maid, leaning towards her young mistress, quietly said that it was time for them to return back to the palace, since business there already required their presence, and the time for further delays was limited, because the situation was becoming increasingly tense. There, the worried maids were already waiting for them, who quickly ran out of the house, heading towards their mistress, worried about her long absence and trying to bring the girl back so as not to miss anything important in these anxious moments, because everything could change. Very soon, they returned together back to their native walls, to the stone palace where the young concubine lived, and where the usual luxury, silence, shining columns, marble floors, and many faces ready to carry out orders, but not inspiring confidence, awaited her. Suddenly, the cute little girl froze in place, scared to the point of goosebumps and clenching her fingers, because right in front of her, she saw an unfamiliar woman in a sky-blue Chinese-style dress with long brown hair, standing at the entrance, as if emerging from a dream. As if on a special signal, she suddenly turned around, and in a voice that sounded too loud, clear and feigned joy, it was heard. What happiness that the mistress concubine was still able to return to the palace without suffering from the dangers of the outside world. At that very moment, one of the maids of the empire's huge palace, without a second's hesitation, as if driven by a protective instinct, stepped forward and resolutely stood between the mistress and the stranger, loudly declaring that she had dared to disturb the order and touch the empress's concubine. The frightened faces of the other young maids turned pale, as if gray ash had fallen on their soft cheeks, but one of them ran after the guards, realizing that the violation committed by this woman could cost everyone their heads if the matter reached the ears of the master himself. The beautiful Sanya Yoren watched silently, feeling the ghostly aftertaste of someone else's fingers and cold words on her shoulders, and a premonition flared up in her little heart that something more terrible than just chance connected her with this strange creature. At that very moment, one of the maids, without hesitating for a second, rushed forward with great courage, standing between them, and, defending the little one, loudly declared that the woman dared to touch the Empress's concubine herself, which was the greatest insult. The girl suddenly screamed with a desperate note in her voice, claiming that she was a lady-in-waiting who had faithfully and devotedly served another high-born concubine, and had now come here to convey an important and urgent message despite the alarm thickening in the air. The adult woman stood awkwardly in one place, looking away in confusion, when the girl, in a quiet, surprised, and slightly anxious voice, asked her to repeat who exactly she served, as if hoping to hear a name that might clarify what was happening. The stately lady, abruptly pushing the little mistress away from her, rudely declared that she had come to convey an important message. The young concubine had been waiting for her in his chambers for a long time, but, unfortunately, she had disappeared, and now, because of her delay, they had to stand there for an eternity. The beautiful little girl, with difficulty gathering herself, instinctively raised her weak arms to the maid for support. Her face reflected fatigue and pain, and her body felt heavy, as if every cell resisted the events that were unfolding around her. Holding back a feeling of great anxiety, the girl wondered what could have prompted the concubine with the blood of a dragon to invite her to his place, because she had neither the will nor the reason to agree to this meeting, which could not help but cause an indefinite fear and bewilderment in her soul. The water was calm and clear, and the lotus petals, like weightless feathers, floated on its surface, creating an atmosphere of peace and amazing beauty, where every detail seemed permeated with tenderness and lightness, and the air itself was filled with harmony. Beautiful Sanya Yoren sank into a hot bath with pleasure, drowning in water up to her nose, feeling how her body gently relaxed, and her thoughts carried her away to a world of complete silence and peace, where there was no place for various worries and anxieties, only peace and tranquility. Suddenly, by some strange surprise, a warning voice came from the pink circle surrounding the bathtub, reminding the girl that the water she was now in was not intended for drinking, and she instantly shuddered with alarm, realizing her mistake. The other maids began to look closely at the flower petals that floated on the surface of the water, their thoughts deep in thought, also doubting whether these petals were safe to eat or whether they were simply decorating the water with their beauty, adding to the mystery of the moment. The lady in the pink hanfu, with a worried expression on her face, raised her hand to the girl's face, sternly ordering her to immediately spit out whatever she had tried to eat in the bathroom, as if she understood that this mistake could lead to undesirable consequences. The servants, growing increasingly agitated, began to spread rumors that these flowers, gliding smoothly across the surface of the water, could be poisonous and deadly, causing panic among all those nearby and making people worry about their safety, creating chaos and unrest. Surprised and confused, as if she had forgotten how to react correctly in such situations, Sanya Yoren froze in place, wondering how the ladies could panic over such an insignificant thing, because there was no logic or rationality in their behavior, and all this looked like groundless fears. Eventually, after investigation, it became apparent that the servants had made a mistake and mixed up the flowers, which led to completely unnecessary excitement, since in fact there were no dangers, and all the noise was simply unnecessary, as it created fear out of nothing. Suddenly, Sanya Yoren attracted all attention by calling her maids and raising her hand, as if giving a signal that what was happening required immediate intervention, and her words were supposed to be the key to solving this incomprehensible situation, capturing all eyes. Pointing her finger at her mouth, the little girl, with a slight blush on her cheeks, a little embarrassed, quietly and plaintively said that she had not eaten anything and was only feeling hungry, trying to convince those around her that her behavior was not connected with any problems, but rather with innocent weakness. All the maids started and exchanged anxious glances when they heard that the girl had not eaten anything while sitting in the bath, for this only increased their anxiety that her behavior might be connected with some ailment that was invisible to them, which they perhaps could not immediately recognize. The basket of flowers that had been carefully placed on the floor was accidentally thrown down, as if out of fear or carelessness, and the bright petals scattered across the floor, adding chaos to the already tense atmosphere, and the flowers scattered like a symbol of anxiety. The servants, looking at each other in embarrassment and realizing that they had created a panic out of nothing, stood with expressions on their faces, and the little fool, barely holding back her laughter, could not help but feel the absurdity of what was happening, since all this fuss seemed ridiculous, as if they were ready to perceive any trifle as a catastrophe. The silver-haired lady, whose gaze was full of determination, sternly ordered everyone to gather their will into a fist and not be embarrassed, forcing everyone to hold themselves with dignity and not show emotions despite all the heat, confidently demonstrating that only a cool mind would help them overcome this moment. The concubine sat in complete silence, kneeling quietly to her chest, watching the argument between the maids, her gaze calm and attentive, and she felt how her presence added a hidden tension to the moment, creating the feeling that she was that invisible core. Soyeon and Kvaisa, always by the girl's side, took her under their protection. One was dressed in a light pink dress, and the other in a strict dark outfit, both with serious and determined expressions on their faces, ready to intervene at any moment, as if they were her support and hope, the embodiment of strength. The girl began to think that her maids were just secondary figures in her life, insignificant characters whose role was limited to just carrying out orders. But soon she realized that they were much more human and strong individuals with their own will. In the original, the little maids were not mentioned much, remaining virtually invisible as supporting characters forgotten in the background of the main character, making their existence barely noticeable, as if their role was minimized, as if they had no significance. At first, nothing was said about them in the book, but later they were depicted as scoundrels who did not hesitate to make fun of and say barbs towards their mistress with obvious contempt, as if they did not see anything worthy of respect in her, but only considered her weak. The little girl, lost in her thoughts, still remained in the water, not understanding why the maids were so nice to her, unlike how they acted in the original, where their relationship was cold and distant, as if she was a stranger to them and not important. Suddenly, one of the young maids handed her a towel, and, sternly telling her that she needed to get up or she might catch a cold, warned that staying in the cold water was a health risk that could be avoided if she got out of the water in time, without delay. The ladies immediately came to the rescue and began to dry the cute little girl, wrapping her in a warm towel, as if caring for her as if she were their own child, and each of them tried to do everything so that she would not freeze in the remaining water and felt safe. Young Sanya Yoren blushed in embarrassment as they began to wipe her down, and the maids carefully removed the moisture, as if trying to help her return to normal, since her embarrassment was obvious, and she could not hide her awkward feeling. Soon they all gathered and headed to the concubine's palace, whose windows were open and the street was quiet, while the palace was a luxurious building with many maids dressed in blue dresses, creating a sense of wealth and grandeur. Sanya Yoren, her mouth wide open in surprise, could not hide her impression of what she saw when she first found herself in one of the richest and most majestic palaces belonging to one of the empress's main concubines, amazed by the scale of his property. His huge palace alone, in comparison with the sweet little girl's house, turned out to be 3 times larger, filling her heart with admiration, as if she had realized for the first time what real wealth and greatness are, which is sometimes not so easy to appreciate initially. Suddenly, the man's maid, sharply pointing her finger at the guests, without any explanation, declared that only Sanya Yorn herself could go further, and everyone else should remain outside the palace and wait outside, which caused slight bewilderment and made everyone feel out of place. Soyeon and Kvaisa were indignant at this order. They could not even think of letting their little mistress go alone at such an important moment, especially when the whole palace and its grandeur concealed many secret dangers and various difficult trials. However, the rude maid, slightly bowing her head in a sign of inevitability, stated with cold confidence that such actions of other ladies violated palace etiquette, and even the closest ones must respect the rules established for maintaining order and strict discipline. Sanya Yoren stood there, feeling awkward and confused when she was finally invited to continue her journey, but without her loyal servants. And this feeling of loneliness against the backdrop of the majestic palace only increased her anxiety, as if she was losing her footing in this unfamiliar world. Suddenly, the lady-in-waiting grabbed the girl by the hand with such force that the girl screamed in pain, barely holding back her tears, and, trembling, asked the concubine not to make the empress's chief concubine wait, otherwise it could lead to trouble for everyone. Soyeon and Kavesa, completely shocked by such rudeness, opened their mouths in amazement and prepared to intervene to protect their little mistress. But they realized that they could not say a word against those who were higher in status than them, and therefore remained silent. But they could not utter a word against those who were much higher in status than them, and so they stood silently to the side, helplessly watching as their mistress was led away, feeling an internal struggle that they could not express in words, realizing their powerlessness. Sadly and irritated, Soyeon and Kavisa stood aside, their eyes filled with worry and hidden anger. But they knew that in this difficult situation, their intervention would not change anything, leaving them with a bitter feeling of helplessness. The woman roughly squeezed the cute Sanya Yaran's small hand, so hard that it seemed as if bruises would remain on her delicate skin, and her every gesture was full of cold force, as if the girl did not deserve even the slightest respect and care. Together, with quick steps, they walked along the long corridor, the maid pulling the girl along behind her, paying no attention to her attempts to resist. And in this cold, sterile movement, there was something almost threatening, as if the very atmosphere of the palace sought to suppress her will. In one of the rooms, the handsome Miran Aryun was already sitting, blindfolded, his mysterious silence giving everything that was happening an atmosphere of mystery. And next to him stood another person, whose presence only increased the tension in the air, adding suspense. The servant, barely glancing at his master, said that he had recently read an ancient scroll, which mentioned that a guest was to come to him, whom he himself had invited. And now, it seemed, the moment had come. A meeting with this guest was becoming more inevitable than ever before. Obediently, Sanya Yorn realized that the time had come to meet the young concubine. Her mind began to form words ready to burst out. But suddenly, the maid standing next to her abruptly interrupted her, loudly speaking words that left her no chance to continue. The maid, without waiting for a continuation, decisively informed her master that she had brought the girl to him as ordered, and her words, like the tip of a sword, cut through the silence of the room, instantly forcing everyone present to pay attention to the unexpected turn of events. Miran Aryun, hearing her words, turned his head in their direction and froze like a statue, as if at that moment his mouth was silent and his gaze pierced the space, penetrating into the very essence of what was happening, as if his every movement was filled with secret meaning and deep importance. After Miran Aryun stood up from his seat with incredible determination, he walked towards them with a confident step. Every step he took was full of intent to figure out what was happening, and it seemed like he was ready to find out all the details that were hidden behind this clash. Miran Aryun, with a look of rage on his face, roughly grabbed his maid by the hair and punished her for her disrespect, reminding everyone that discipline and order were the foundation that every person in his huge house had to obey. The girl, hearing the stern words that she had to conduct the girl with due respect and reverence, shuddered with fear, realizing how seriously her mistake could affect her position, because her master always adhered to unyielding and strict standards of behavior. Miran Aryun, with a grin that was filled with undisguised mockery, turned to the maid with a sharp question as to why she had brought the little girl without showing due respect, leading her like a vagabond, without the slightest sign of respect, which caused considerable shock to everyone present. Sanya Yoren, watching the events with obvious concern, carefully followed every movement with a frowning face, her heart beating faster with fear, as she could not understand what would happen next in this tense and painful moment full of uncertainty. The faithful servant, standing with his hands folded in front of him, knew internally that now was not the time to punish careless servants, because his master was always fair. But at this moment, everything was not as usual, and everything that was happening required a different approach. The concubine, with eyes glowing like flaming dragon flames, jumped up in surprise when he realized that his cruel actions were not meant for the eyes of an innocent child at all, and now he could not believe how terrible his behavior was at that moment. Therefore, without hesitating for a moment, he let down the maid's hair, pushing her away suddenly and sharply, which caused the girl to scream in pain, because her body, like her soul, could not withstand such a cruel act, forcing her to clutch her chest in despair. With an interest that hid a barely noticeable shade of discontent, the man turned to his servant with a question about what to do now so as not to frighten the girl, because his eyes, like bright lights of dragon flame, shone with cold determination and anxiety. His eyes, filled with a deep scarlet light, sparkled in the semi-darkness with a predatory brightness, as if the abyss itself was visible through them. In each of his glances there was a silent threat, and the air next to him became oppressively heavy. The maid, feeling her heart beat faster, shuddered when the sentence was passed on her, to send her to the flower garden, which, as it turned out, was not just a punishment, but a real test, capable of changing her fate and mental state. The concubine, with a smile that concealed a mixture of regret and politeness, apologized to the new concubine for what had happened, noting that she would have to become a participant in this entire terrible scene, which she would forever remember. Sanya Yoren, looking down slightly guiltily and adjusting the folds of her light silk dress, admitted that it was she who had made a mistake and was late, but her companion noted with a slight smile that ceremonies and formal etiquette were not at all necessary. Looking up in surprise and slowly blinking in surprise, the young beauty tore her eyes away from her thoughtful thoughts when she was offered to forget about boring traditions and instead enjoy the exquisite aromatic snacks prepared for her arrival. Miran Aryun, squinting with a slight slyness, gracefully adjusted a strand of hair, and with a soft intonation in his voice, asked the girl if she would be against spending a little time with him in a secluded, cozy environment, away from prying eyes and noise. With a slightly strained, politely maintained smile and a light sigh, young Sanya Yoren quickly realized that she had no chance to refuse, and so, gathering the remnants of her dignity, reluctantly, but still gracefully, agreed to the proposed meeting. They strolled leisurely through the graceful carved pavilion, decorated with fine patterns, where below lay quiet water, strewn with delicate lotus petals, surrounded by a rustling forest, to which led a neat stone staircase in an interesting Chinese style. A fine porcelain cup with an elegant pattern was filled with warm amber tea, which was poured with special attention, as if the tea drinking itself was a sacred ritual worthy of respect, silence, and unhurried contemplation of the beauty of this moment. The girl, like an obedient servant with light movements, bowed reverently, completing the ceremony of pouring fragrant tea, and silently stepped aside, giving way to a place in the gazebo where there was furniture specially designed for sophisticated tea drinking. The exquisite table, made of dark wood with carved legs, was decorated with a variety of sweets and treats, neatly laid out on elegant dishes. Each dessert looked like a small work of art, enticing with its taste and aroma. Sanya Yoren, barely containing her surprise, peered with curiosity and slight wariness at the variety of exquisite treats. Some of them were completely unfamiliar to her, as if they had flown in from a distant Eastern fairy tale and were appearing before her eyes for the first time. The man laughed softly into his fist, looking down slightly, and admitted that he was worried, not knowing what kind of food the children preferred. And so he brought a lot of different treats so that the little girl could choose what she really liked and what would suit her. Sweet Sanya Yoren bowed forward slightly and quietly thanked the man for such touching care, trying not to look like a spoiled or capricious girl in his eyes, because she wanted to show restraint, respect, and great gratitude. The man, who now looked calm and even smiling softly, had previously seemed completely different. In a rage, he was capable of terrifying things, and not long ago, he almost beat up a maid right in front of her, just for the slightest sign of disobedience. Then, unbridled anger splashed in his quiet gaze. Rage seemed to flare up instantly, and Sanya Yoren clearly saw that the man was truly angry at the servant who dared to disobey a direct order, and only by a miracle no one suffered from his hot temper. Suddenly, the sweet young man, smiling with slight timidity, unexpectedly turned to her, saying that he would like, with her permission, to address her by name without excessive formality, wishing thereby to emphasize friendliness and get closer without violating the boundaries of any decency. After saying these words, Miran Aryun lightly touched his chin with a graceful gesture and apologized with sincere regret, because, according to him, during their first meeting, he must have scared her a lot, especially when she accidentally saw his unusual frightening eyes. Changing his tone to a more serious and almost threateningly cold one, the concubine added that he had not at all sought to frighten her with his frightening, unusual look, but he noticed that she had restrained herself with dignity, and despite her fear, had not allowed herself to show weakness. The girl frowned. Her gaze became thoughtful and intent. She carefully considered a possible answer, as if weighing each word, trying not to reveal the feelings hidden under the calm mask, and not to show what impression his words made on her. Once upon a time, a great and powerful empress was able to conquer the heart of an ancient dragon precisely because she accepted him completely, without fear or disgust, even in the terrifying form of a beast. And this became a symbol of deep loyalty, true love, and the strength of a fearless heart. The handsome young man froze in place with genuine amazement when he heard that he had not actually frightened the girl at all, and a surprised relief appeared in his gaze, as if this confession had dispelled his previous doubts and worries that had lurked in the depths of his great soul. In response, the young girl smiled softly, her feminine voice sounding warm and calm as she said that everyone in their people had the same eyes, and looking down, she apologized for unwittingly causing him to worry and be tormented by vain doubts. The charming young man suddenly changed, as if his great anger had changed to mercy. His face was again lit up by a sincere smile, and he said that now he felt as if a heavy stone had fallen from his heart, freeing his soul from the oppression that had been pressing all this time. Suddenly, the young and intelligent Miran Aryun slowly raised his hand, and the girl stared at him with slight confusion and obvious surprise, not understanding what exactly he wanted to do and what to expect from this unexpected gesture that disrupted their calm conversation. The beautiful girl flinched slightly when the grown man, looking at her with gentle wariness, suddenly asked a very unusual question. Could he, just once, stroke her head if she did not mind, and allowed him to do so with all due respect? Having received her calm and almost shy consent, the man's hand slowly reached out to her. Long, graceful fingers approached with caution. In this gesture, one could feel an unexpected softness, rare for such a formidable and reserved man. Stroking his new concubine on the head with almost fatherly tenderness, the cunning Miran Aryun quietly said that she was surprisingly kind and sensitive, and reminded him how many times before she had sincerely apologized to him, trying not to hurt men's feelings and showing respect. After this, the guy, without changing his soft tone, mysteriously added that not all people would be as friendly as she was, and therefore the girl should not reveal his secret to anyone, even if someone seemed kind. Trust can sometimes be deceptive. With a light, understanding smile, the girl confidently replied that she understood his hint, and of course, would keep this secret a secret, because if he trusted her with it, it meant that the sweet beauty had truly earned his trust and was now obliged to justify it, no matter what the cost. Their leisurely, warm conversation came to an end, and the stern man, lazily looking up into the sky, noticed that time had flown by unnoticed. The sun was already sliding over the horizon, painting all the clouds in scarlet golden hues, foreshadowing the end of a long day. An unexpectedly warm, surprisingly gentle palm gently touched the tender cheek of the young girl, and the handsome young man, with a slight smile, asked if the noblewoman would like to join him and dine in his luxurious palace, where a generous table with treats was already set. High above the graceful roof of the pavilion, light birds flew. The sky was covered with transparent clouds, and the cool evening breeze, filled with the aromas of an elegant garden, swayed the branches of the trees, creating a feeling of serenity, good comfort, and quiet closeness. On the table in front of them was a variety of amazing Chinese dishes, aromatic soups with herbs, hot and spicy appetizers, steamed buns, fried meat with vegetables, as well as sophisticated desserts decorated with petals and various paintings. With graceful, polished movements, the Chinese chopsticks with their delicate patterns carefully picked up an appetizing golden brown piece of delicious fish from a fragrant plate covered in steam and gently brought it to her lips in anticipation of the first taste. Without thinking for a moment, the beauty, with slight haste but without losing her grace, confidently shoved the tender, fragrant food into her mouth, allowing the taste to spread throughout her tongue, and felt herself shudder internally from unexpected pleasure. She almost burst into tears right at the table, almost couldn't hold back, because the taste was so amazing, deep, rich in spices and aromas, that her heart trembled with surprise. It was like a blessing from heaven on a woman's soft lips. Her carefully thought-out plan of merely pretending to eat, while secretly refusing to eat so as not to reveal her disgust, had failed completely. For now she knew that she had tasted the food of the gods, and it was simply impossible to refuse. Pleased as a little chipmunk, the beauty happily began to eat all this food in a row, not paying attention to the variety, and each new taste seemed more and more delightful to her, like a true pleasure that was impossible to refuse. When asked by another handsome concubine who noticed her unusual meal, the girl responded with slight embarrassment and agreed without hesitation, and casually mentioned that she was barely 8 years old, which was an unexpected detail in their long conversation. To which the man, slightly frowning and thoughtful, drawled that 8 years is still not that long in life, and she has so much ahead of her to learn, see, experience, because the most important moments of life are just beginning to flow, and she has not seen much yet. He carefully pointed to her face with his hand, carefully, like an experienced artist, studying her features, and quietly, with a slight intensity in his voice, asked why she never laughed, despite the fact that her face was truly beautiful, like a delicate petal, but hid some unknown sadness within itself. Gently, with a slight tenderness, he stroked her soft cheek, as if trying to soften some invisible barrier, and said that with a smile on her face, she would be even more beautiful, like a flower that cannot fully open until it lets go of its great fears. The little girl froze in horror, her eyes widened in surprise and fear, and even her breath was held, because the man's voice sounded not just soft, but with some kind of threatening subtext, which left no doubt about his intentions and made her heart beat faster. The girl forced a smile onto her face, trying to hide her inner uneasiness, and laughed quietly. But her laughter was awkward and timid, because she was afraid that she would be punished if she did not do it the way he liked, and her heart was beating wildly from great fear. The concubine, seeing her tension, removed his hand from her face and softly said that the girl was the kindest, as if trying to reassure her so that she would feel more confident, but there was still some hidden tension in his voice, as if he knew that she was afraid. After that, taking another dish with exotic ingredients with his chopsticks, he offered the little girl to try it, assuring her that she would definitely like it, because this dish contains the real magic of Eastern cuisine, which even those who have tried it cannot forget. And his words sounded like an order. Young Sonia Yoren's whole body trembled, and her heart sank with fear that the man might have given her something tasteless, trying to deceive her or test her tolerance, and as if sensing a catch, she looked at him with alarm, but did not dare to refuse. Slowly, with visible tension, she bit the piece of fish, her teeth clenched like wooden sticks, and she felt her body tense, ready for any unexpected turn, feeling how the taste began to slowly fill the woman's mouth. After that, when she finally swallowed, her heart sank in horror, and she froze, realizing that she might have made a mistake, feeling a strange taste that made her wonder if it was normal or if she had made a mistake, internally weighing the consequences. She covered her mouth with her hands, realizing that she was feeling nauseous again, and tried not to cough, afraid that it would only make her feel worse. She held her breath, trying to regain control, but she increasingly felt her body beginning to succumb to the reaction, and her mind losing clarity. Without waiting, she suddenly jumped to the side and began to cough loudly, trying to take a breath to calm her dry throat. But the cough did not stop, as if it did not want to let her go, and with each new attack, it seemed that her strength was waning. The man sitting next to her watched her with an unusual expression on his face, feeling an inner uneasiness, and, frowning slightly, quietly asked if everything was all right with her. He noticed her obvious anxiety and saw how sweat was dripping from the woman's forehead in large drops. The young man turned to her, noticing how pale she had become, and with a worried expression on his face, declared that she looked quite unwell. The girl, suppressing a cough, tried to remain calm and replied that she was all right, despite the obvious weakness that had taken hold of her body. Before they could calm down, another handsome concubine with bright red hair suddenly burst into the room, his face distorted with anger, and he angrily shouted the other guy's name, causing everyone to flinch at the harshness of his voice that broke the silence. It was Garam, the handsome concubine, who entered the chambers with a bright expression of malice on his face. He stood frozen at the entrance, his arms spread out to the sides, as if preparing for action, his face full of displeasure and anger, and his presence filled the room with tension. Young Sanya Yoren, feeling the horror grip her body, covered her mouth with her hands in fear, trying to hide her anxiety. The woman's gaze darted around the large room. She could not understand what exactly he was going to do, and the fear that had gripped her did not let go. Garam froze in shock, his face distorted with sudden bewilderment and displeasure. Frowning, he could not believe that here, in this place, he saw a girl, completely not expecting her appearance in such a situation, which only aggravated his irritation and complete anxiety. Without wasting any time, he strode towards the couple sitting at the table, his steps quick and determined, as if he knew he had to act immediately to sort out this unexpected situation and find out what was going on, as well as punish those who dared to disobey. With a sharp movement, he grabbed the blonde by the clothes, roughly pulling him towards himself, as if not allowing him to retreat or justify himself for a second. Rage flashed in his eyes, and his hands clenched into fists, ready to strike, and he was ready to destroy the one who dared to do so. Looking aggressively at his interlocutor, Garam said with contempt that he was a stinking scoundrel. His face turned red with anger, and the veins on his temples bulged. His eyes sparkled with rage, like those of a beast ready to attack and instantly kill, without any. Miran Aryun froze in bewilderment when he heard the question of what he was going to do with the innocent little girl, his gaze full of confusion and internal conflict, because he would never allow himself to do something like that. But now he was forced to justify himself. After this, the young man, with irritation in his voice, quickly replied that he had not done anything like that and had no intention of doing so, trying to drive away the terrible anxiety and all the various doubts that had arisen around what was happening, because he was confident in his intentions. Garam quickly turned towards the girl, looking her over carefully, as if checking to see if she had been harmed by the recent events. His quick movements were full of determination and care, and despite his displays of aggression, he could not allow her to be harmed by someone else's actions. Sanya Yoren, frightened and trembling, could hardly hold back her breathing, which was becoming more and more intermittent from fear. Remaining seated at the table, she instinctively tried to hide behind its wide edges, feeling how every movement of Garam caused her an increasing feeling of anxiety and uncertainty. The man, without showing any further complex emotions, pushed the blonde away from himself, while firmly ordering the girl not to be afraid of him, and also to say directly if she was forced to eat something bad or unpleasant that could frighten the noblewoman. Miran Aryun, feeling the tension in the air, calmly and confidently put his hand to his chest, after which he replied that the girl could have continued to enjoy the meal if it were not for the intervention of Garam, who with his aggressive behavior disturbed the calm atmosphere of the dinner. These words, however, clearly did not please the red-haired guy. He clenched his teeth tightly, his gaze became more and more intense, and, without hiding his displeasure, he ordered his interlocutor to repeat what he had said, preparing for further conflict. Miran Aryun, as if guided by an unknown instinct, full of care and anxiety, hastily walked towards the frightened girl and, approaching, with amazing caution, wrapped his palms around her waist, intending to lift her, like a tiny bird, from the ashes of fear. Finally, the handsome guy gently picked up the baby in his arms, pressed her tightly to his chest, like a precious crystal vessel, and, stroking her back, began to speak with incredible tenderness, assuring her in a whisper that everything was already over, she was safe, and there was no more room for fear. Sweet Sanya Yoren, who had not expected such a change, stood frozen as if paralyzed in his arms, not daring to move. And while he whispered consolation, an alarming thought flared up inside her that Miran Aryun must have been a man with a broken mind and a complex spirit. The powerful Garam, seething with rage, pointed a trembling finger at the other concubine and shouted so loudly that his voice rang out, declaring that he had no right to treat the little girl so roughly, to which he only shrugged his shoulders and replied that her name was Sanya Yoren, and it was sacred, watching as the girl, like a priceless treasure from distant legends, was carried in his arms through the silent crowd. The man, his gaze blazing and his face distorted with anger, almost belched out a huge flame, shouting for the impudent concubine to immediately put her down on the ground. With a slight bow of his head and a wry smile, the handsome Mirin Aryun, with deliberate calm and a subtle hint of mockery in his voice, remarked that if Garam did not stop his reckless behavior, he would, alas, have to be taught a couple of refined lessons in etiquette. Suddenly, breaking the fragile silence and the growing tension between the men, the girl, as if having gained rare courage, quietly spoke up and, turning her head towards the blonde, calmly said that now he could let her go. After all, she really was already feeling good. Obediently, as if touched by something unknown, the sweet young man carefully released the girl to the floor, and she, staggering but maintaining her balance, carefully stood up on trembling legs, feeling how with each breath the lost feeling of inner strength returned to her. Bowing with an easy, almost theatrical grace, Sanya Yoren respectfully thanked him for the beautifully presented and exquisite dinner, especially noting the aromatic sauce and delicate texture of the dishes, and, glancing at her watch, said that it was time for her to go home. Miran Aryun, leaning on the back of the chair and looking after her with warmth and a slight thoughtfulness in his eyes, nodded understandingly, and then, trying to speak softly, expressed the hope that one day they would still be able to spend many more quiet and joyful evenings together. Young Sanya Yoren, having barely said goodbye, turned sharply and, without looking back, quickly rushed away along the empty, echoing corridors of the palace, as if fear was chasing her, dreaming of escaping from under the heavy gaze of the concubine as soon as possible and returning to silence. The strong Garam, narrowing his eyes and waving his hand in irritation, shouted at the girl with surprise and resentment in his voice, demanding to explain where she was heading in such a hurry, and that she at least stop and wait for him at the gate outside. A warm and velvety evening had already set in on the wide street. The breeze lazily ruffled the leaves of the trees, and Sanya Yoren, pressing her hands to her chest and inhaling the air, stood alone in the courtyard of an ancient Chinese palace, listening to the silence and holding back a strange trembling in her chest. Raising her eyebrows in surprise and mechanically turning around at the sound of footsteps, she noticed how another young concubine, who had obviously left the building in haste, hurried out into the courtyard and, noticing her lonely figure, immediately called her by name. Restlessly approaching her, the man, not hiding his concern in his voice, leaned closer to her, trying to carefully examine her facial expression in the dim light, and quietly, almost in a whisper, asked if everything was really all right with her, if something irreparable had happened. The young man, slightly nervous and trying to speak calmly, began to question her in more detail, explaining that he had heard from one of the ladies of the court that Miran Aryun had invited her to his palace, and he was sincerely worried that he had caused her serious harm. The girl, feeling a little awkward in this situation, smiled tensely, and trying not to show her excitement, calmly replied that everything was completely fine with her, that nothing terrible had happened, and the noblewoman was sincerely grateful for the attention and care. After these words, she obediently bowed her head as a sign of her great respect, apologized to the concubine for her sudden escape, thanked him for his concern and kindness, and then quietly said that she really had to go and should return home already. Leaving that red-eyed boy kneeling in a secluded corner of the palace, the girl walked away with a firm, determined step and a determined expression on her face, realizing that it was indeed time for her to leave, as her thoughts were already far from that ill-fated place. Garam was horrified and surprised to himself. Did the girl really think he was worse than that vile dragon she had encountered before? Because her reaction was clearly unpredictable and irritating, and he didn't know at all how to treat it correctly and humanely. The brown-haired man, realizing that the situation was getting out of control and becoming increasingly tense, violently hit the boy, scolding him for standing by, silently watching, while the others argued, not trying to intervene or change the course of events in her favor. The men continued to argue while one of the friends told the guy that he was a real fool, silently standing and watching as the little girl's only friend was taken away. And in response, he never said a single word, completely ignoring what was happening. The young man froze in surprise when he learned that the girl was only 8 years old, He had long thought that she was barely 5, and now, realizing her real age, he realized that he had made many hasty and incorrect conclusions about her naivety, life, and tragic experience. His interlocutor sighed irritably and replied that yes, she was only 8 years old, and despite this, she was not at all well in her own female family, that she was experiencing real suffering inside, which the man had not even suspected before. The little girl was kept in captivity, starved, secretly tortured, and, as it turned out, sometimes even beaten, leaving her in complete isolation, which led to her severe psychological trauma, which she was forced to confront with such fortitude. The strong Garam froze in shock. Now it became completely clear why the aristocratic family sent their daughter here with only one maid, because the hidden cruelty inside her house left an indelible mark on her. And now he understood her actions. The man, shocked with great horror, put his hand on his friend's large shoulder, trying to somehow support him at this moment, when they both realized the full gravity of what had happened to this poor girl, and began to understand how to proceed further in order to fix everything. And then he strictly ordered him to go and return the little girl to the female maid so that she would take care of her and look after her fragile condition, in particular her best friend, who could be there while the beautiful girl recovered. The backyard of the palace, decorated with beautiful white statues that shimmered in the morning sun and intricate Chinese patterns that created an atmosphere of deep antiquity and mystery, created an amazing sense of calm and tranquility. The young man turned his head from side to side, not knowing where to go, looking for the lady to whom he had to apologize for his haste, but he could not find her. The tension increased, and he felt his heart begin to beat faster, because he did not know how she would react to his words and actions. He remembered how the other maids had asked him for help, but how could he help the one he couldn't find, especially when she avoided him, as if she was hiding from him, not wanting to communicate with anyone in this huge and frightening palace, full of secrets and corners where every step could hide danger. However, the man had good hearing, and he caught even the faintest sounds that could give him a clue about her location. His attention was focused on the slightest rustles, and every movement could lead him to the right place where she was hiding. Finally, he found the little girl. She was sitting on a tree, all alone, in the forest, where her figure merged with the shadows, seemed to be part of this mysterious and silent place, and the woman's gaze was directed into the unknown, as if she was looking for something important and long lost. However, as soon as she noticed him approaching, young Sanya Yoren jumped up from her seat and ran away as if she was afraid of him, her legs carrying her forward at a furious speed, her heart pounding in her chest, and anxiety gripping her more and more with every step, forcing her to hurry. As she suddenly tripped and fell, her dark hair flying in the wind, making it feel like time had slowed down, and everything around her disappeared in an instant until she found herself on the ground, and she felt a terrible pain in her wrists, feeling an icy fear take over her body. The young man stood there in shock, not knowing what to say. He was stunned by how quickly the situation had escalated, and he didn't know what to do to calm the girl down and relieve her of the terrible fear that had chained her to the ground. His heart was full of doubts, and his thoughts were confused. Tears appeared in the little girl's eyes, and she bitterly asked the boy not to kill her. Her voice was trembling and full of despair, as if she had experienced too much pain for her age. She looked at him as if she believed that her life really depended on his decision. Now horror gripped the young man. He could not believe that anyone could harm such a small girl. It was incomprehensible to him. He hastened to calm her down, assuring her that he would not kill her. He was not capable of such cruelty, even if the situation required it, but his words could not calm the fear. Garam bowed his head in frustration, feeling disgusted for seeing this little girl as a threat. He knew it was unfair. She was so innocent and helpless. His doubts and suspicions now seemed insignificant and completely irrelevant. And now, standing in the palace of someone else's concubine, the man was horrified that the little girl could be more afraid of him than the lizard he once fought with. It hurt him because he realized how terrible he looked in her eyes. His actions and decisions began to seem unworthy to him. The moon, like a crescent moon carved from the purest silver, floated slowly across the deep and endless night sky, radiating a pale glow over the large courtyard outside, where the trees whispered and the shadows slid slowly over the stones, coming to life in the embrace of silence. A thin, tense hand, with graceful, almost transparent fingers, persistently tapped on the cold wooden surface of the table, beating out a dull, uneven rhythm of alarm, as if a heart, full of anxious forebodings, was beating somewhere on the verge of a major breakdown. Sanya Yoran, once a carefree, charming girl in an airy dress made of thin fabric, by the will of fate became an accidental witness to a terrible secret. She learned that the concubine of a powerful empress was a real dragon, hiding his appearance for centuries. Miran Aryun sat hunched over a heavy oak table, his face covered by his hand, his eyes tired and confused, wondering what to do with the little girl whose little life, suddenly intertwined with his, began to resemble an unsolved mystery. He felt strangely confused, not understanding why she seemed alien in his presence, tense as a string, restrained to the point of aching, as if she sensed in him a hidden threat or a painful reminder of something that hurt her to the depths of her soul. He still kept in his memory her soft, warm, sincere smile, the same one that lit up her clear eyes, shining with joy, when he once, with timid hope and inner trepidation, asked her to smile, and how tenderly he then ran his fingers over her cheek, as if protecting her from all troubles and worries. He hunched over and dropped his face onto the rough, cool surface of the table with a dull, almost painful sigh, feeling a bottomless emptiness slowly growing in his chest, not understanding what he had done wrong, why the little girl had not simply smiled back, but had tried with desperate kindness. Suddenly, a clear, confident, and commanding knock on the old, creaky wooden door burst into the silence of the room, breaking the shaky and fragile calm, and only a moment later, a familiar voice sounded behind it. The concubine, maintaining dignity and severity, asked permission to enter. The young man stepped inside with a noble grace, as if dancing in the shadow of the light, folding his hands before him in a respectful gesture, bowing his head, and in an even, calm voice reported that he had managed to find out everything the gentleman wanted to know, and even more than he himself had assumed at the very beginning of the dangerous journey. Quietly, almost whispering, the guy said that among all the information carefully collected and studied over the past few days, one strange, disturbing detail had suddenly surfaced, which did not fit into the rest of the picture at all, and caused a persistent, sticky feeling of anxiety. The baby's stay with the Sanya Yoran family was completely absent from any known archives, papers, and digital documents. No mentions, no traces, not even indirect data, as if she had never been there, as if she was just a fiction, an illusion, or a forgotten shadow of someone else's memory. A single square Chinese lantern, hanging at the dilapidated entrance of the old mansion, continued to burn in the midst of the deep, almost ringing silence of the night, dispelling the darkness around with a soft, unnaturally warm light, as if guarding something forgotten and disappeared in this place. There were absolutely no visible traces in the mansion that a child had ever lived there. Only old, time-worn things, dusty shelves, peeling walls, and a silence that rang with a sense of loss, as if the house itself was keeping someone erased from the world. It was for this reason that the faithful servant, having collected in his mind all the inconsistencies, guesses, and disturbing gaps, came to a sad and cold conclusion. Everything they knew about the girl could be a lie, a substitution, or even an artificially created fictitious story hiding someone's guilt, and Miran Aryun soon came to the same sad and disturbing conclusion, that her own family, apparently, did not value the girl at all, considered her superfluous and a burden, and therefore, without a drop of sympathy or regret, sent her to the Empress's palace, as if she were a thing or payment for something. It was obvious that Kyun Yoran, acting cold-bloodedly and with calculation, really had some kind of manipulation in mind, since he decided to send his own daughter to the imperial palace without even thinking about the consequences, her feelings, or the dangers that could await her there at every step. The dragon, standing in the shadows by the column, growled softly and frowned darkly, and his blood-red eyes narrowed dangerously, flashing with anger and inner tension, as if he had detected in these words some deep threat to the very order of things and the inevitable result. The starry sky, covered with a multitude of dimly flickering lights, spread out over the palace, wrapping the night in a bewitching, mysterious blanket. It was beautiful to the point of pain, and in this silent radiance, It seemed that even the stars knew more than they were ready to tell living mortals. The little girl herself, seized with icy fear, hugged herself with her arms and trembled from the terrible cold, clenching her fists as she walked at night along the deserted, obscurantist street, trying not to look at the dark, hostilely silent shadows that surrounded her from all sides. Tears and snot clouded her eyes, and she could not understand how she could be sent out into such a terrible cold night in the icy frost, without protection and comfort, leaving her alone and helpless on the street, like a restless shadow, forgotten by everyone who should have taken care of her. She grabbed the cold door handle with her hand, trembling all over, feeling how every step she took echoed throughout her body with unbearable pain from the cold, loneliness, and uncertainty, as if every moment was a test of her last strength, and the fear and uncertainty in her heart only grew stronger. However, when she knocked on the door with hope, no one opened it for her, and there was not a single warm look or word of comfort at home. Young Sanya Yoren was left standing on the street, shrouded in frost, completely alone and confused, like a forgotten shadow, almost like he himself was forgotten. The girl, without despair, decided to try knocking on the door again. Perhaps they simply didn't hear her, or maybe they weren't expecting her, or forgot about her. But she still couldn't give up her last hope for warmth and care, at least somewhere here, even if everything was against her. As soon as the maid in the bright pink outfit jumped out of the palace, she loudly shouted her mistress's name, as if expressing her immense joy at returning, attracting the attention of everyone around, and her words echoed in the silence, creating a sense of unprecedented importance of this moment. Sanya Yoren froze in place, not expecting such a violent reaction, because the girl was prepared for a much calmer and more restrained behavior, and did not even have time to prepare for such a turn of events that made her feel like she was in the center of attention. Kavisa exclaimed with joy when she finally heard her name spoken by her mistress, her spirit rising and feeling delight overwhelm her, despite all the indifferent people around her, forgetting for a moment about everything except this great happiness. The other young maids lightly reproached their sweet companion for being too proud and too enthusiastic, but she, without embarrassment, enthusiastically replied that they were all simply jealous of her joy, and their reproaches only confirmed how lucky she was. After this, the servants, with smiles on their faces, extended their hands to the younger lady, inviting her to quickly enter the palace, where all the necessary comforts and honors awaited her, as if she were the center of the entire majestic world. And, it seemed, everything that was happening filled her hearts with pride. Slightly hesitantly, but with obvious excitement, the little girl extended her thin hand towards the maid's palm and squeezed it, as if there was more tenderness and trepidation in this gesture than words could express at that moment. And in her gaze, there was a childish weariness mixed with silent gratitude. The maid, having sensed the piercing cold emanating from her mistress's thin fingers, sat down next to her with concern, and, looking straight into her eyes with trembling concern, quietly whispered that her hands had become like ice, as if her heart had just emerged from an icy abyss and was still trembling with anxiety. Kavisa, suddenly angry, began waving her arms furiously in the air, expressing her indignation and outrage that anyone would even allow Sanya Yoren to be sent out at night, in the freezing cold, all alone, without an escort, as if she had no value. Soyeon took a deep, tired breath, as if holding back the accumulated emotions inside, and gently but persistently suggested discussing everything that was happening inside the palace, where it was warm, safe, and the wind did not ruffle her hair and thoughts, and the silence of the halls allowed her to think more clearly. At that very moment, the servants, in unison and respectfully, let their mistress go forward, surrounding her on both sides, as if with an invisible guard, and solemnly escorted her inside, where they were already waiting for her with impatience and hope, and the warm light of the hall enveloped her like a mother's embrace. In her mind, Sanya Yoren caught herself thinking that as her gaze slid over the faces of the servants who surrounded her with care, trying to ease her condition, her heart became a little warmer, as if the very silence inside her began to thaw under their silent devotion. The ceiling of the room was done in a strict Chinese style, carved and dark, with laconic wooden beams that created a feeling of coziness that had lost its warmth. A lamp, darkened by time, hung sadly from the central beam, swaying in the draft. On the next bed, surrounded by tangled sheets and a damp handkerchief on her forehead, lay a girl, her face deathly pale, her breathing heavy, intermittent, as if every effort to breathe was forced, and it was obvious that she was ill. Her body was pierced by fever. Young Sanya Yoren slowly and hesitantly rose from her bed, feeling weak in her body and a slight tremor from illness. But despite her discomfort, she took a step forward, deciding to check if the fireplace was burning in the room and whether it was possible to get at least a grain of warmth from it. But as soon as Sanya Yoren carefully stepped barefoot onto the icy stone floor, her body immediately trembled treacherously from weakness, and she was unable to keep her balance. With a dull thud, she fell to her knees, feeling a wave of chills roll across her skin, as if the cold itself had grabbed her by the shoulders. The small, fragile hand trembled as it slid across the rough, icy surface of the stone floor, and its fingers helplessly clung to the cracks in the slabs, as if instinctively searching for at least some shelter, at least a weak source of warmth, which was not there at all, only silent stone. With her last strength, pressing her blue lips together and trying not to cry, the little girl grabbed the edge of the heavy blanket, pulling it towards herself with trembling and weakening fingers, as if trying to hide inside from all this merciless reality, to draw in at least a tiny spark of warmth, maintaining her balance. Unable to cope with the growing trembling, she slowly, as if under the weight of an invisible weight, climbed back onto the bed and, hiding like a frightened animal in its hole, covered her head with the sheet, dreaming of the return of at least illusory warmth. This moment of despair and vulnerability suddenly stirred up vague images of her childhood. Her mother's light hands, like the wings of an angel, her gentle voice, and the soft, enveloping warmth of her chest, where it seemed to her that troubles would disappear as soon as she covered herself with a soft blanket. Once upon a time, in another, almost forgotten life, where she was still a carefree child, her mother, like a quiet guardian of the night, sat by her bed, gently touched her hair, and whispered that everything would be fine as long as her voice sounded nearby and warmed her with maternal warmth. In that distant time, when the whole big world seemed smaller and safer, her mother, in the semi-darkness of the old room, would place her palm on her forehead, listening to her breathing with reverent anxiety, as if she were guarding the fragile, tender universe, saving it from pain, fear, and loneliness. With a hand trembling from endless excitement and fatigue, she carefully wiped the sweat from her face, hoping to at least slightly reduce the excruciating heat that was increasingly taking hold of her, leaving behind only a feeling of hopelessness and oppressive pain from which there was no escape. But despite all her efforts, there was not a single person around the girl who could help or support her, and only the cold, empty room with cracked walls, filled with heavy silence, became more and more suffocating in its unbearable silence. Burning from the unbearable heat, the sweet girl tried with every new effort to fall asleep, hoping that with the coming of the morning, her condition would improve, and the painful suffering would finally disappear, giving way to long-awaited peace and at least a little relief. The worried maids, with anxiety and confusion in their eyes, walked around their mistress, discussing how her body seemed to have refused all food, and with each step they carefully checked her pulse, worried about her health and life, not losing this hope. The girl, half asleep, barely caught the words of the maids, who, whispering, discussed her condition, claiming that she had a high temperature, and apparently this caused an allergic reaction, because of which her body was fighting the disease so fiercely. The head maid, realizing the seriousness of the situation, sharply commanded her partner to immediately go and bring cold water, because every second could be decisive, and it was necessary to act as quickly as possible to ease the suffering of the mistress. Young Sanya Yoren, on the other hand, was consumed by excruciating pain, suffering from every muscle tension. Her body ached, but her head was especially throbbing unbearably, from which it seemed that her mind was about to burst, leaving her in a state of complete helplessness. The servants, overcome with anxiety and worry, tried their best to calm their little mistress, begging her to hold back and endure the excruciating pain, hoping that she would soon feel a little better. But despite their efforts, the girl's suffering did not diminish, and she continued to suffer. Having learned of this tragic incident, the Empress, without waiting for reports and detailed information, decided to immediately come in person to check on the girl's condition, because rumors about her grave condition quickly spread, and her heart could not bear the thought of a possible loss. The adult woman who entered that room quietly whispered an apology to the sleeping girl, feeling deep regret for not being able to look after her properly, and her heart was aching with guilt as if she had left the girl alone. The girl, barely moving her weak arms, reached out to the lady's palms, asking her with a trembling voice to leave, believing that if she really cared about her, the lovely girl would go away and leave her in silence, because her heart longed only for peace and complete solitude. However, the powerful empress took this gesture in a completely different way, and with incredible tenderness and care, she hugged the girl, pressing her to herself, giving her warmth and security, like a mother who is always ready to protect her child from any danger. Leaning towards the sweet girl with a soft smile, the adult lady quietly but confidently said that now everything would be fine, and no one would harm her anymore, because her care and protection would always be there, ready to protect her from any trouble, giving her a sense of security. With her fingers, she gently stroked the girl's hair, feeling how her breathing became more even, and, thanks to this gentle touch, the girl began to feel how her heart was filled with the necessary warmth and confidence that all the bad was already behind her, and there was only a bright path ahead. A new day had dawned, and although the room remained empty, with the quiet sounds of the outside world, the only reminder of the outside world was the look at the ancient Chinese tree outside the window, which symbolized the inexorable passage of time and the continuation of this life. Sanya Yoran woke up in her bed, opened her eyes, and stared at the ceiling in surprise, as if trying to comprehend where she was and what was around her, feeling a slight confusion that still lingered because she couldn't believe that the night was finally over. She rose from her bed in surprise, realizing that the headache that had tormented her the day before and deprived her of strength had disappeared, leaving her in a new, fresher, and restored state. Now the woman's mind was clear, and her body felt light and free, as if all the heavy things had been left behind, finally giving way to calm. With a soft, welcoming smile on her face, the maid leaned closer to the bed, her voice soft and caring as she politely asked the young mistress how she was feeling, whether she was in pain, tired, or showing any signs of illness from the excitement she had just endured. Remaining in a sitting position on the soft bed, the little girl, with a slight anxiety in her voice, asked the woman where the empress was, to which she calmly replied that the lady had returned to her fire palace to rest and put her thoughts in order. As if a weight had been lifted from her soul, the girl breathed a sigh of relief. Her shoulders dropped, and a rare expression of peace appeared on her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt relatively safe, at least for a few moments of silence. Suddenly, the grown woman, silent and majestic in her calm, slowly raised her hand, her long, slender fingers stretching forward with grace, as if in anticipation of a gesture that was about to break the peace and bring something new into this frozen scene. Placing her warm palm on the girl's forehead, the maid said with relief that fortunately, the little mistress's high fever had already passed, and now, it seemed, her health was on the mend, which she was sincerely happy about, looking at her with care, concern, and quiet joy. Sanya Yoran stared at the woman in surprise, her eyes widening in surprise, and in that look there was something between distrust and embarrassment. She was not used to such affection, especially from a servant, and simply did not know how to react to it correctly. Noticing the confusion on the young lady's face, the maid quickly pulled her hand away in alarm, lowering her head in a sign of guilt, and with obvious remorse on her face, apologized for her mistake, admitting that she would not have dared to touch her mistress without her permission, even with the best of intentions. Sanya Yoran, still sitting on the bed, took a deep breath, as if trying to drive away the remnants of anxiety, and, her voice warming a little, she restrainedly assured that she was fine, because the soft sheets, warm light, and silence around gave a feeling of safety and long-awaited peace. The maid, without changing the severity of her face, straightened up even more, as if wishing to emphasize her authority, and continued to stand silently, keeping her posture restrained, and her gaze intently focused on the girl, clearly not intending to give in to the argument. Sanya Yoran, sensing this hidden challenge, pressed her lips together and crossed her arms even tighter across her chest, expressing an unspoken protest. Her gaze showed childish determination and indignation, because it seemed to her that no one wanted to understand her desire for freedom and space. The maid, in a restrained but persistent manner, tried to convince her mistress that the little lady should under no circumstances go outside in such cold weather, to which the girl screamed indignantly, declaring that she had been dressed too warmly and that nothing bad would happen to her. Syllable by syllable, restrained but confident, the adult maid repeated that the girl was strictly forbidden to go out into the cold air, as this could lead to an even greater deterioration in her health, and she insisted that caring for her health was most important. A second maid, dressed in a pink hanfu, joined her, sternly confirming her words, believing that the first one's actions were completely justified, and not hiding her concern that the little mistress could go out into the street in such a state. Both maids, like strict volleyball players protecting their net, stood nearby, carefully watching every move of the little mistress, not allowing her to deviate even a step from their instructions, as if emphasizing that her safety is their first priority and her will is only within the established boundaries. The little girl frowned, feeling strangely uneasy, and suddenly felt a slight blush appear on her cheeks, as if her heart began to beat faster from sudden awkwardness in such a tense atmosphere where her independence was in doubt. Then the little girl sneezed loudly, and her little body shook, as if to signal that the illness that had been creeping up on her for a long time had finally decided to show itself, taking hold of her and leaving no doubt that she was beginning to fall ill. At that moment, the air was filled with anxiety. The servants, noticing that the little girl was ill, froze in horror when they realized that their concerns for her health had only increased, and the risks were too great to leave her without due attention and rest in such conditions. They silently exchanged glances, realizing that her future well-being depended on their actions. The girl found herself in even warmer clothing. She was tightly wrapped in a soft fur coat and a cozy jacket, while the drops slowly flowing down her nose became a clear and unmistakable sign that the disease had begun to take its toll, confidently taking its position. The beautiful Sanya Yoran cast a disdainful and irritated glare at the servants, who continued to wrap her up with care, giving the impression of excessive attention, and she, deep down, wished that this care would stop and they would finally leave her alone. Sanya Yoran, her hands on her plump cheeks, sank into thought, trying to figure out what to do on this dull day, because boredom was becoming an increasingly intrusive companion with each passing moment, and no thought could dispel this heavy shadow of loneliness. The tired little girl, struggling to overcome her fatigue, collapsed onto the bed, her arms stretched out helplessly along her body, as if the weight of fatigue itself was wrapping itself around her, and she could not find the strength in herself to get up or even do anything, absorbed in inaction. And then, as if by magic, a servant in a pink hanfu appeared at the door. Her face lit up with a slight smile, and she suggested in a quiet and kind voice, perhaps they should unpack the gifts that had recently arrived at the palace, thus giving this moment an unexpected but pleasant note. With a calm and unperturbed expression on her face, the lovely girl turned to her servant. Her gaze became thoughtful, and she, as usual, began to speculate about who these gifts could have belonged to, and what secret was hidden behind their unexpected arrival. After that, the girl looked up from the window, her voice calm and indifferent, as if everything that was happening did not matter to her, when she said that the servant could choose gifts for her, without paying attention to other details and without caring who sent them. However, at that moment, a young servant dressed in a dark silk outfit replied that these gifts were from the Empress herself and two other beautiful concubines, which involuntarily brought into her thoughts a feeling of strange surprise and slight interest in what was happening. The tired little girl sat up on the bed. Her gaze remained indifferent. She looked attentively at the servants, but her thoughts were absorbed in one single question. Why did the Empress and her concubines send her these gifts, and what was the meaning behind this gesture? Suddenly, the lady, with a light and quick movement, clapped her hands, and her order was immediately given to the servants to go at once for the gifts, without delaying this important matter, for they all had to be brought as quickly as possible, without any delay. Sanya Yoran clutched her small head in bewilderment, her thoughts racing in search of an answer to one single question. What exactly could they have sent her in these mysterious gifts, and what meaning was hidden behind such an unexpected act? The gift boxes were so heavy and large that one could only guess how many different items were hidden in them. dozens or even hundreds of wooden chests filled with various things, but unknown to her. The senior servant suddenly waved her hand in front of her with an irritated sigh and, with a slight displeasure in her voice, said that all these things were sent by the great empress herself, but at the same time she doubted how valuable or important they could be. The gift from one of the concubines stood out in particular. It was a mysterious bird, wrapped in bandages, which aroused curiosity and questions in the girl's soul. What was hidden inside, and what deep meaning was hidden in this strange and mysterious gift, bringing a riddle? After this, the girl's head nanny, without showing the slightest interest in what was happening, waved her hand, ordering the servants to leave and return only in the evening, leaving her alone with the gifts, which it seemed had already begun to evoke strange and restless feelings. The maid in pink, trying to attract attention, carefully pointed to a strange black box that stood out among the other gifts, attracting attention with its unusual shape and shade, as if it contained some old secret that needed to be solved. The lady, with a light and mysterious expression on her face, handed the thing to the girl, asking her to first open it, without delay for a second, because it was precisely at this moment, in her opinion, that something important and incredibly valuable could be hidden, which needed to be seen as soon as possible. Sanya Yoren, after listening to herself for a moment and feeling her heart begin to beat faster with anticipation, took the key that seemed to have been created just for this moment, and just at that moment she was about to open the black chest, hoping that something extraordinary was hidden inside. The girl froze in shock, realizing that this key was not just an ordinary object, but was made of expensive metal, which immediately alerted her and made her think about the meaning of this gift, its value and origin, as if it was sent with a special purpose. This key was carefully inserted into the hole of the beautiful lock, and after turning it a few times, she eagerly felt how the lock gave in with a slight click, revealing a hidden secret inside, which now seemed even more intriguing and no less mysterious. Inside were new pink baby shoes, decorated with gold flowers and Chinese-style embroidery, which added a special sophistication and significance to this gift, which clearly indicated its exclusivity, as well as the high status of the one who presented it. The maids, noticing the girl's surprise, explained with respect that the shoes were made of the most expensive silk, and it was clearly a gift from the empress herself, which could not help but arouse admiration for its refined beauty and high cost, confirming her high status. Slightly disappointed and wary, Sanya Yoren asked doubtfully if she could even wear such an expensive item without feeling uncomfortable and unsuitable for such a gift, which was clearly too expensive and had deep meaning for the empress. The senior maid nodded with a smile, replying that the empress clearly had a special liking for Sanya Yoren, and this gift was not just a casual gesture, but a token of special attention and favor that she could wear with pride, because such a gift was a privilege. The little girl stood thoughtfully on her new shoes, not understanding why the empress began to treat her with such special caution, as if there was something more behind her attention than just a desire to take care of her or show kindness. The grown woman was clearly worried. The beautiful noblewoman had come to her that night to check on her health, worried that the girl might feel ill or very tired, despite her young age and attempts not to disturb her with unnecessary worries. The girl reacted with doubt to the maid's offer to try on the new shoes, because she was afraid to put on such expensive and luxurious shoes, not knowing how to handle them properly, and what would happen if she accidentally ruined such a valuable gift. Suddenly, in the distance, her gaze stopped on a creepy toy that looked like a monkey, in whose hands were muscle discs that, with each collision, made a metallic sound, filling the space with a strange atmosphere of anxiety and worry. The servants obediently answered the young lady that this gift was also from the empress, a rare gift from the West, brought especially for her, which only emphasized its uniqueness and significance, and also attracted attention with its high cost and sophistication. Another box stood out from the rest, large, long, white, with a pink bow that attracted attention with its brightness and unusual shape, as if it hid something amazing, majestic, and equally unusual that was waiting to be revealed. This gift turned out to be a rocking chair brought from the western region, made of rare wood, which was so interestingly and unusually processed that it immediately attracted attention with its sophistication and craftsmanship, as if it was created especially for her. Without thinking twice, the little girl sat down on her new chair, put her feet on the footrest, and with a light sigh, settled herself more comfortably, allowing herself to enjoy the moment of peace and comfort that this unexpectedly pleasant gift brought her. Feeling how the tension goes away and her body is filled with peace, she began to rock slowly in the chair, her face filled with complete delight, expressing incredible surprise with pleasure, as if every moment brought her more and more relaxation, and she could not contain her joy at the unexpected comfort that enveloped her. The baby's face became peaceful, her smile was filled with warmth and satisfaction, and her eyes reflected deep relaxation, as if she had finally found peace and harmony in this moment, forgetting about all the worries and cares that were so familiar to her. The servants, watching her joy, also felt satisfaction, seeing that their efforts were not in vain, and that they were able to please their mistress, giving her such a long-awaited and appreciated moment of rest, filled with sincere joy and great pride from this. Sanya Yoran, lulled by the soft rocking of the chair, quickly fell into a deep and serene sleep, absorbed in the silence and comfort that each moment of her rest created, leaving in her soul a feeling of peace, security, obvious peace, and all harmony. The servant carefully straightened the blanket, covering the baby with it so that her fragile and defenseless body would be protected from the piercing cold, giving her sleep special care, warmth, attention, and tenderness, as if the young girl was guarding the small world of her innocent dreams. The girl carefully covered the baby with a soft blanket, trying to keep her from freezing and from waking up from the cold, because her comfort and safety were important for everyone around her, creating an atmosphere of coziness, warmth, care, and complete peace. After which, the grown ladies set off on their journey, accompanying their sleeping friend, allowing her to sleep peacefully and enjoy her sleep in the silence of the night, while they moved along the night road, slowly and friendly, talking to each other, enjoying complete peace. The blue sky filled with light clouds and warm sunny weather created ideal conditions for a relaxing holiday, allowing you to feel one with nature, complete peace, tranquility, and enjoy every moment under the bright rays of the sun. The window was decorated with wooden chests standing nearby, and in the room, amidst the cozy atmosphere, stood a vase of fading flowers, filling the space with a shadow of light sadness and natural beauty, as if time had stood still, and the world outside the windows continued to move on as usual. Awkwardly stepping over the threshold, the strong Garam entered the little girl's room, greeting her with a blush on his cheeks, raising his hand up as if trying to relieve the tense atmosphere with his presence, but not knowing how to properly behave, leaving a feeling of discomfort in the air. With a doomed look, the young Sanya Yoran looked at him, not understanding why he had come, because her thoughts were occupied with other questions, and his sudden appearance did not give her peace, causing bewilderment and slight anxiety, as if her world had lost its stability. When the man approached cautiously, trying to ask about the girl's well-being, she replied that she felt completely fine, not letting anyone know that her thoughts and feelings were much deeper than one might assume, hiding a storm of experiences behind her outward calm. The guy looked down, embarrassed, feeling shy and awkward, because he couldn't understand how he had come to visit the little girl so brazenly, disturbing the peace of her cozy world, which she had so carefully protected, while his actions were completely unexpected and inappropriate. After which he hurried to the window, opening it with concern and saying that the room was too hot, as if trying to correct his actions, but not realizing that his actions were only making the situation worse, creating even more tension and terrible discomfort in the air. However, when he looked outside, the guy's face began to express horror and shock. He realized what kind of weather it was outside, and immediately felt how his feelings were mixed with confusion, as if all his confidence melted under the bright rays of the sun, turning his anxiety into slight fear. The vase, almost caught by his sudden movements, wobbled on the windowsill and, as if in slow motion, began to fall down, leaving behind only a slight tremor in the air, a harbinger of inexorable destruction and imminent disaster, as if nature itself had frozen in anticipation. The thing shattered loudly, scattering into pieces across the floor, and the sounds of destruction echoed throughout the room, creating an atmosphere of even more awkward silence, where even time seemed to stand still, as if waiting for his next move to make things a little better. Garam ended up standing there awkwardly, realizing that he had not only broken the window, but also the vase, feeling like his actions were turning into a series of unfortunate actions, getting stuck in this moment, like in an endless cycle of awkwardness and hopelessness, where every step he took only deepened his feelings of guilt. The man's face turned pale, expressing complete embarrassment and confusion, and awkwardness literally radiated from him, creating an atmosphere of awkwardness and embarrassment around him, as if his whole body was saturated with this feeling, unable to go away, like a heavy burden that he could not throw off. A broom was taken, and with the kind of precision that is characteristic only of those who truly value order, the fragments of the broken vase began to gather in one place, disappearing under her smooth and confident movements, returning the long-awaited peace and cleanliness to the room, as if nothing had happened. The maid quietly took away all the trash, doing everything with such delicacy, as if she did not want to disturb the fragile balance of silence that had come after the unexpected incident, and Garam, feeling awkward, asked the girl if she liked the vase. The young man, like a frightened puppy who had just broken an important rule, knelt down in front of the little girl and promised that he would bring her exactly the same vase, or maybe even better, hoping that this gesture would help restore her trust and extinguish his own embarrassment. But as soon as the girl quietly and with a smile remarked that it was not worth bringing a new vase to replace the broken one, the young man was overcome by a barely perceptible but deep feeling of relief, because he fervently hoped that her soft words were a sign of forgiveness for that stupid and annoying oversight. The little girl, with a gentle and bright smile, continued to look at him attentively. Her gaze seemed to envelop him in warmth and kindness, making it clear that she did not hold a grudge and had long since forgiven him for what happened, not wanting to attach undue importance to the awkward moment. The young man, trying to make amends and at least somehow please her, began talking about how he had sent her as a gift an exquisite chest of drawers, carved from rare bone with exquisite carvings, and an amazing mosaic made from crystal of all the colors of the rainbow, as if he wanted to decorate her world with wonders. When asked if the girl had already tried to play with any of the gifts she had brought, the little girl suddenly froze, as if taken by surprise by this unexpected reminder, since in fact she had not yet managed to unpack any of the gifts, leaving them untouched. The young man awkwardly waved his arms to the sides, hastily muttering that she shouldn't have apologized at all, and even more so rushed with answers, because he didn't want to cause her a drop of anxiety or awkwardness, but only wanted to talk and dispel all the woman's doubts.
After that, he resolutely put his hands on his hips as if giving himself importance and
With a wide, almost heroic grin, full of that same childish but sincere courage, the young man hastened to say that if suddenly someone allowed himself to threaten her or make her afraid, let her immediately tell him, and he would definitely deal with everyone. Quickly, decisively, and without delay, the little girl, carefully folding her hands in front of her and looking at the young man with a warm, hopeful smile, asked in a quiet voice if he really was telling the truth. Would he become her protector if danger came and someone hurt her? The guy answered in the affirmative, but immediately after these words, the girl cheerfully, almost playfully, extended her hand forward and, as if jokingly ordered the young man to immediately leave her palace, implying with a slyness in her voice that if she followed his own words, then he was her very first enemy. The young man, stunned and confused, sank down on his knees right on the carpet with quiet melancholy, as if he had suddenly lost the ground under his feet, and the maid, standing next to her mistress, snorted irritably, crossing her arms over her chest, as if she was not at all surprised by such a turn of events. And suddenly, as if an unexpected breath of fate, the Empress herself slowly entered the room, casting a stern and surprised glance at the young man walking past her, with his shoulders down. He looked sad, lost, as if his whole world had cracked. She, with the same mysterious and slightly sly smile, said, as if by chance, but with an intonation full of hidden meaning, that it turns out the powerful Garam really was visiting the girl. And this confession sounded almost like an official confirmation of the events. The boy stood silently, barely breathing, barely holding back the tears that were welling up. His eyes were shining, and his heart was beating so loudly that it seemed everyone in the room could hear it. He raised his gaze, full of resentment and confusion, to the ruler of the empire, and under her icy gaze, he felt insignificant. When the empress, in a calm and reserved tone, asked about what had happened, Garam, hesitantly and tensely pointing his finger in the direction of the little girl, said in a trembling voice that the girl herself had ordered him to leave, and he had obeyed, because he would not have dared to disobey her order. Confused, with a slight resentment in her gaze, the woman pointed at herself with her finger, as if trying to comprehend what was happening, and with casual calm in her voice asked the little girl if she, like the young man, should not leave these stone walls, as if she herself were a stranger here. The girl, barely holding back her rising anger, pulled a polite, forced smile onto her face, and almost through her teeth, but still confidently answered that for her, it was a great honor that such a high-ranking person dared to step onto the threshold of her small palace. For the young man, this sounded like a final verdict. He stood as if defeated, internally feeling the weight of loss, and in that moment he realized that he had lost without even starting a real battle. And the ruler, in turn, smiled contentedly, as if she already knew the outcome. The woman, discreetly tossing a lock of hair behind her ear, approached the bed on which the little girl was sitting, placed an elegant carved chair next to her, and, slowly and with dignity, sat down on it, taking the place opposite, as if preparing for a conversation in which every word would have weight. The lady looked at the little girl with a slight smile, and sweet Sanya Yoran quickly realized that she was expecting her to be the one to speak first, as if giving her a chance to make a decision and start a conversation, which gave her time to comprehend everything that was happening and prepare for a long conversation. Bowing politely, without getting out of bed, the little girl thanked the lady for the gifts she had sent. Her words sounded sincere and grateful, although there was a slight wariness in her eyes, as if she was still thinking about the situation and did not dare to trust. The woman, with a slight but slightly guilty smile, explained that all the gifts had been planned and sent in a hurry, which meant that the quality of some of them left much to be desired, and this had become an unexpected difficulty for her, although she sincerely hoped that the little girl would understand her intentions. The sweet little girl again thanked the empress for her generous gifts. However, with slight regret, she added that her palace was too small to accommodate all this splendor, creating an atmosphere of slight sadness and inability to fully appreciate the gift. The lady became alert as the realization finally dawned on her, and she raised her eyebrows slightly, as if she had suddenly caught something important that had previously escaped her attention, thereby making the woman's gaze become significantly more focused and intent. Then she turned to the wooden boxes, her gaze deep and thoughtful, and quietly muttered that, despite the size of her palace, it was still too small to accommodate all her thoughts, cares, and the gifts she was so eager to give. The lady promised with a slight smile that she would soon solve this problem, and her face was filled with confident calm, as if she knew exactly how to act in this situation, leaving no doubt in her determination, attracting everyone's attention. After which the woman, bending slightly, said that she had come here to give the little girl a small gift, and began to take something out of the wide sleeve of her green hanfu, as if revealing to the girl a small secret with a bright and unusual miracle. The girl was handed a red bag, neatly tied with a gold ribbon, and with a gentle request, they asked the girl to open it to see what surprise was hidden inside, spurring curiosity and excitement, making her fragile heart beat faster. Slowly, with a little excitement, the little girl began to untie the bag, carefully pulling on the golden ribbon. Her fingers, which seemed so small and uncertain, but full of curiosity, gradually revealed the secret that was hidden in this small but wonderful surprise. When the bag was finally opened, there was a delicious cookie inside that looked exquisite and inviting. Its aroma instantly filled the air, causing the girl to feel a sweet excitement, and she looked with admiration at the long-awaited gift. Sanya Yoran looked at the gift with interest, noticing that it was a pastry from the western region that looked delicious and appetizing, and her eyes filled with delight at the thought of how delicious this wonderful treat could taste. The little lady, barely containing her sincere joy, smiled imperceptibly, and happily agreed to give the cookie, feeling the warm, almost maternal gaze of the woman, who was obviously pleased that she was able to present such a pleasant surprise. The lady came a little closer to the little girl, said something in a soft, encouraging tone, and, despite her outward severity, her gaze radiated deep respect, as if she could not give the girl anything more, but still showed sincere kindness and care. The Empress's hand slid gently and caringly across the girl's cheek. Her touch was soft, as if trying to convey her tenderness and protection to the girl, making the little girl feel safe, as if the world around her had become a little brighter and calmer. After this, the Empress placed her hand on the little girl's forehead, relieved to find that her fever had finally subsided, and feeling confident that the girl was now feeling better, she sighed softly, smiling happily, calming her great anxiety. Then, the great Empress raised her head and, looking at Sanya Yorn with slight concern, asked how often she had nightmares, because her gaze expressed concern and a desire to help, finding out the reasons for the anxiety that tormented the girl so much in her night dreams, causing her to lose her peace. Apparently, that night, when the ruler invited her into her cozy room, she thought that the girl was probably having a nightmare and decided to show concern, feeling that now was the time to support the little one in her worries and fears that tormented her so often. Slightly nervously, but sincerely, Sanya Yorn answered that she often had bad dreams, and despite her fears and worries, she tried to speak calmly, without showing her inner excitement, hoping that her words would be understood and correctly perceived by the woman. The lady tenderly embraced the beautiful little girl, pressed her to herself, and, with a soft smile, said that if she had another nightmare at night, she should not be shy, but should simply call her, and she would immediately come to calm and protect the girl from all her night fears and worries. Holding back her barely restrained tears, the girl yawned softly, saying that she so wanted to sleep peacefully, standing excitedly in front of the ruler of the empire and enjoying her warm and comforting embrace, feeling safe, as if the whole world had suddenly become kinder and lighter. Suddenly, completely unexpectedly, the adult lady picked up the baby in her arms, hugging her tightly around the waist, as if wanting to surround the girl with protection and love, which gave her confidence and calm at that moment, giving her a feeling of complete peace and confident reliability. The woman carefully placed the girl in her arms, gently telling her to sleep and not to worry about anything, assuring her that everything would be fine. Sanya Yoran, calmed by care and love, gradually fell asleep, feeling safe and comfortable like never before, plunging into a sweet sleep. By evening, the sky was painted in bright pink shades of sunset, and clouds, like light feathers, floated smoothly across the surface of the sky, creating an atmosphere of peace and tranquility, inviting you to immerse yourself in a wonderful, warm feeling of the evening, full of harmony and beauty. The little girl in her new blue dress, with her eyes narrowed, was trying to figure out when she could finally open her eyes, feeling slightly nervous, but her face expressed curiosity and impatience, despite the fact that she still felt the remnants of sleep, fighting the desire to sleep. The servant led her to a specially designated place, quietly saying that very soon they would arrive and soon find themselves in a place where she could calmly and joyfully continue her journey, revealing more and more curiosity, and her thoughts, lulled by the quiet step, were already far from everything that was. Soyen and Kavisa continued to lead the little girl to the same place, as if not paying attention to their uncontrollable bickering, playfully teasing each other and cheerfully cursing, which gave the moment a lightness and ease, despite the seriousness of the situation. Finally, the girl was allowed to open her eyes, and she felt a thrill of anticipation filling her as she waited for this moment. Every moment seemed filled with magic, and her heart beat a little faster in anticipation of what was to come. The little one opened her big purple eyes, radiating obvious surprise and great curiosity, as if the world around her had become even more vivid and exciting for her, full of new impressions, bright colors, and sounds that she had only just begun to perceive fully. Her new palace was truly enormous. Its walls shone red, and its architecture, done in the ancient Chinese style, delighted with its grandeur and sophistication, creating an atmosphere of undeniable power and immeasurable prosperity, as if history itself were recreating its greatness. At this time, The empress sat on her throne in her formal robes, her majestic posture and calmness emphasizing her status. She said that it was time to move on to a new agenda, expecting her words to be heard and received with due respect. A magnificent garden, immersed in greenery, with clear ponds along which red flowers bloom, and along their edges there are low fences, giving this place an atmosphere of privacy and tranquility, as if this entire corner of nature is hidden from the bustle of the outside world. The flowers by the lake, among which lotuses bloom majestically and water lilies sway peacefully in the water, create harmony and peace, adding tenderness and beauty to this picturesque corner, which seems to personify peaceful tranquility. The maid told her mistress with a gentle smile that this residence was now her new home, and although it had previously belonged to another concubine, subordinate to the empress, she proudly accepted it as her destiny, gratefully gaining her new position. That day, the ruler of the empire took the little girl's words about her house being too small as a personal insult, and despite the modesty of her request, she decided to give her a majestic palace, thereby demonstrating not only her power, but also her deep attention to her needs. The little girl could hardly hold back her tears, as she always tried to be invisible, avoiding unnecessary attention. But this unexpected kindness and generosity became a real miracle for her, which she could not fully comprehend, not knowing what to do with such a gift. Standing in front of the new house, the little girl realized that with the gift of the palace came new, much more serious problems, and now she did not know what to do with them, how to cope with this new stage of her life, which put her in a difficult situation. The woman's hands clenched tightly into fists, and her fragile heart sank with an anxious premonition, because in her world, every new step brought not only long-awaited joy, but also the weight of responsibility that she still had to cope with, without knowing exactly how to do it. In the original, the battle of the concubines in the harem was known for its bloody cruelty, which became a real massacre, and participating in this merciless struggle turned out to be completely different from what she expected from her destiny, which she now had to learn to manage and accept its challenges. That day, among all of them, there was one special guy who, like the master of water, led it, playing with its deep and mysterious depths, and his eyes, like two bright sapphires, reminded of those who drowned forever in this pond, leaving an indelible mark on themselves. The workers carried the boxes and crates filled with the concubines' belongings, without fatigue or the slightest hesitation, carefully placing them in the carts. Their bodies bent under the weight, but the work required speed, and they continued to work diligently despite their fatigue. Puzzled, the girl turned to her companion with a wary look. Her face, as always, was immersed in deep thoughts, and her mouth was slightly open, as if the words were already ready to escape from her lips. But something inside kept her silent, frozen in this important moment. The head maid stood with a serious and stern expression on her face, which radiated determination and strength despite her refined appearance, leaving no doubt about her high professionalism and the absolute power she wielded in this house. The lady clearly enjoyed the Empress's special favor and possessed enough strength, determination, and influence to protect Sanya Yoren from any threat, while displaying a confidence and fortitude that certainly commanded respect and even admiration from all present. The maid, having caught the anxious notes in her young mistress's gaze, sat down next to her with concern, softly and sympathetically asking her to share what was gnawing at her heart, because every movement, every gesture betrayed her deep inner uncertainty and obvious anxiety. Pot, carefully watching Sanya Yoren's facial expression, peered into her eyes, trying to understand the hidden emotions, and suddenly realized with surprise. In her heart lives a question that she can't bring herself to ask the lady, embarrassed by her own hidden feelings. Embarrassed, the girl with a slight blush on her cheeks looked away, and, in an almost inaudible voice, with notes of uncertainty in her intonation, asked the maid if she could stay with her that night, because the feeling of loneliness sometimes so urgently needs warmth and support. The embarrassed woman blushed slightly, trying to remain calm, and with a slightly strained smile carefully clarified what exactly was meant by the word overnight, giving the question a naive tone, although there was a subtle alarm and internal discomfort in her voice. The little girl, with a barely perceptible shyness in her voice, restrainedly admitted that she was often haunted by frightening dreams, And that was why she experienced real fear when she had to spend the night alone in this large, unusually cold, and still strange house, where everything seemed new and foreign. The woman shuddered slightly, as if a tension had squeezed inside her from which there was no escape, after which she slowly exhaled and, looking down at the floor, calmly but restrainedly said that the mistress was without a doubt higher in position than she, and she did not dare decide with whom she would be that night. The girl responded by opening her eyes wide, filling them with naive sincerity and quiet pleading, making the most defenseless, touching look she was capable of, and with innocent simplicity asked if they really couldn't sleep together if they both wanted to. The irritated maid exhaled heavily, then waved her hand in annoyance, and without trying to hide her fatigue, muttered with a hint of irritation that in principle they were indeed allowed to spend the night together if the mistress gave her consent, although this went beyond the usual order. Night descended silently upon the earth. Bright stars, as if by an invisible hand, were scattered across the dark sky, as if someone had absent-mindedly spilled a handful of light onto a soft velvet surface, and everything around was filled with coolness, silence, and the promise of protected peace. The maid, having settled down nearby at the head of the bed, vigilantly watched the baby, covered with a light blanket, who was curled up in a cozy ball on the soft futon and gradually plunging into a serene slumber, trustingly snoring, as if in complete safety and peace. Suddenly, the silence in the room was broken by Sanya Yoren's soft voice coming from behind the door, and she came inside, tilting her head to the side, with a gentle smile asking if the long day had exhausted her, and if those thoughts that had tormented her recently were still bothering her. With a soft, almost maternal smile, the woman said in a quiet, soothing voice that everything was indeed in perfect order, and the lady should not worry anymore. The night promised to be calm, the stars would be on guard, and the silence would reliably shelter her from all worries and cares. No matter how hard she tried to remain calm, closing her eyes and watching her breathing evenly, sleep stubbornly did not come, as if something subtle and elusive was disturbing her inside, like an expectation, a premonition, a hidden call, reminding, not everything is over. With a good-natured, barely noticeable, sly smile, the maid tilted her head to the side and offered to tell a story, not to lull or entertain, but simply because even adults sometimes need a warm word to let go of the shadow of fatigue. Slightly embarrassed, and almost in a whisper, the beauty admitted that it was not a fairy tale at all, but that as soon as she fell asleep, the maid would most likely leave, and she did not want to be left alone in this strange room, filled with shadows and silence. The woman was embarrassed, her face slightly flushed, and she, as if out of habit, covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hide the slight embarrassment that betrayed her dissatisfaction with the situation. But she quickly regained her calm, trying not to show her feelings, firmly, with complete calm and confident determination in her voice. She assured that she would stay here until the morning, and the mistress should not worry, because she would be there, protecting her. Even if the night hours brought anxiety, the maid would not leave her. The girl, feeling a strange uneasiness, carefully ran her hand along the bed next to her, and with undisguised curiosity asked why the maid did not lie down next to her if she had promised to stay the night, because it would be much more comfortable and calmer that way. After these words, the little girl, with a barely noticeable smile at the corners of her lips, carefully closed her eyes, allowing her body to gradually relax and slowly sank into a warm slumber, feeling completely safe, because the maid promised to stay close and not leave, despite the dark hours of the night. The woman's hand, carefully and with great love, pulled the blanket, which had slightly slipped off the baby's body, carefully covering her, giving a feeling of security and comfort, so that the little lady could calmly fall asleep, not afraid of the cold and the darkness of the night. Sanya Yoren had only recently, just a few days ago, stopped suspecting her of being a spy. And now that the relationship between them had changed, she acted completely differently, like an adult, showing maturity, restraint, and behavior that was not typical for her age. However, the little girl's request to stay with her for the night because she was afraid to sleep alone in this huge house deeply touched the woman, because it showed that her feelings were sincere and vulnerable, and her fear of loneliness was unbearable. The adult woman gently stroked the sweet girl's head, feeling her innocence and fragility at that moment, and her movement was full of tenderness and care, as if she wanted to assure her that she would always be there, ready to protect and support no matter what. Suddenly, the lady's ears caught strange, barely audible sounds, which, despite their barely noticeable nature, immediately caused a slight but persistent anxiety, as if there was a huge threat in the air, ready to appear at any moment, disturbing such peace. She became wary, with a slight suspicion in her eyes, and slowly turned to find out the source of these strange, barely perceptible sounds, trying to understand what was happening and why the atmosphere around her had become so tense, filled with an anxious premonition. A figure stood before her, barely visible behind the closed doors, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. The girl tried to concentrate, watching carefully to make sure that the headmaid whose presence she was trying to discern was not inside. It was a cute young girl named Yeonsu, with brown hair and gray eyes, who quietly entered the room, barely breaking the silence with her presence, as if she was part of this calm atmosphere, but at the same time could not go unnoticed. The servant hurried to her boss, anxiously reporting that she had been looking for her for a long time throughout the entire house, overcoming crowded corridors and tempting fate, and had finally been able to find her, almost breathing a sigh of relief that her search had been successful, despite all the turmoil and enormous nervousness. Respectfully kneeling before the headmaid, with a serious and anxious expression on her face, she reported that it was urgently necessary to go to the Empress, since the situation required immediate intervention, and there was simply no time for reflection and delay. The woman shuddered when she heard that the matter concerned the Empress's most beloved concubine. Her heart sank with anxiety, because not only the concubine's fate depended on this, but also her own position in the house, which could be disrupted at any moment if everything went wrong. Her subordinate bowed her head, respectfully and seriously, telling her that she should hurry up and leave on the errand, because she herself would take responsibility for Sanya Yoren and would monitor her sleep, providing